The Not So Perfect Pair by starcollectorsilas. Summary. In another universe where soulmates exist and are identified by marks in the form of whatever injury your partner has, Chuya Nakahara is about to turn 16, and his best friend Dazai has been endlessly teasing him over the prospect of a mark. However, when he wakes up on his birthday covered in light blue lines, he is unsure what to do, or how to approach identifying his soulmate, and his best friend has been acting in increasingly concerning ways since being told about the marks. Or, what do you do when you're covered in the evidence of your soulmate's self-harm and your bandaged best friend, who you are definitely not in love with, seems to be breaking at the seams? Trigger warning for self-harm that will continue throughout all the chapters of this fic. Please take care of yourself. Chapter 1. In this world, soulmates don't exist merely in fantasy, or only for the lucky few. Everybody has a soulmate, a person who understands them best, who can bring them the most comfort. Most importantly, this world also has a way to find them, existing in blemishes that appeared on your skin whenever your soulmate got hurt, often appearing in their favorite color, the vibrancy of the mark changing depending on how fresh or severe the injury was. For the week leading up to Chuya's 16th birthday, his friends had been persistently teasing him about the looming prospect of him waking up in the morning to a potential mark courtesy of his soulmate. He had brushed them all off for the most part, apart from the comments from his bandaged freak of a best friend. Then he retaliated with something along the lines of, "At least I don't have to wait another month." He couldn't quite place why Dazai's enthusiastic teasing was bothering him so much, but he figured that it might just be the idea of Dazai meddling with his love life. Regardless, he had brushed them all off, putting up a facade of not caring about who his soulmate was, or whether he would wake up with the evidence of their existence or not. This was a blatant lie, as he sat on the bathroom floor while brushing his teeth the night before his birthday, filled with anxiety. What if I don't have a soulmate? What if I hate my soulmate? Or worse, they hate me? What if my soulmate is one of my friends? I would never recover. His hands were shaking slightly, but he stood up, spitting out his toothpaste and continuing his nightly routine as usual, ignoring the pit of dread in his stomach. He changed quickly and collapsed onto his bed, thankful for the comfort of the bed he's had for years. Birthdays were always hard, a stern reminder of the passage of time, but he enjoyed being able to keep hold of dregs of his past. He grabbed his phone from his bedside table and unlocked it, the screen lighting up to display his messages with Dazai. There had been a few since he last checked. Excited for 16? I know you don't like your birthday much, but you fought for me to celebrate mine last year, so we're going to the arcade after school tomorrow. Just us, get away from people, you know? And I already know you're worried about your soulmate. You were doing your weird fist clench thing today when we were joking about it. Don't. It'll be fine. And if it's not, I'll walk you to school tomorrow like usual and we'll figure it out. Chuya was surprised by the seriousness and kindness in Dazai's message. He smiled a little, then frowned. Don't smile at the stupid mackerel's messages, idiot. It'll get to his head. He thought to himself as he looked over the messages again. He was glad for the opportunity to go to the arcade, just him and Dazai again. It had been a while since they had went alone. It was probably better than whatever gift Dazai would give him. He clicked on the message box, responding quickly. Since when were you so nice, asshole? Asshole? The messages were seen instantly, surprising considering that Dazai had sent his messages about 5 minutes before Chuya even looked at them. Consider it an early birthday gift. Kill yourself. Not tonight. I need to give you your birthday gift. And what would that birthday gift be? A big, fat, and sloppy kiss, followed by the best head of your life. First, ew, fuck you, that's disgusting. Second, that's illegal, it'd still be under age of consent. Wait, does that mean no more sex jokes until I'm also 16? Jokes don't mean shit. Genuinely though, what's my gift? Not telling, get wrecked. Oh my god, I'm going to sleep. I'll see you in the morning. With my failed soulmate mark. Soulmate? Plus also you'll be fine. You somehow managed to rarely get hurt, so your soulmate is probably the clumsiest person on earth. You'll probably wake up covered in colorful bruises. Chuya felt oddly relieved by Dazai's assurance, but his attention momentarily zeroed in on the change in Dazai's speech pattern. He never typed out the full you or your. He shoved that to the side, It was likely just that Dazai realized how serious the situation was to Chuya. I hope so. On one hand, if I wake up with nothing, there's nothing I can go off of to find my soulmate. But on the other hand, if there's something, then my soulmate got hurt and I don't like the idea of that. Well, the only way to find out is in the morning. Go to sleep, Chuya. I'll leave earlier than usual tomorrow. Okay then. Good night. Night. I'll be awake for a few more hours if you need anything. Chuya sighed and turned off his phone, placing it back where it had been, plugging it to the charger. Dazai was right. The only thing he could do was wait, and the best way to do that was by sleeping. So, Chuya got up, flipping off his light switch and then settling onto his bed, still able to hear his parents moving around downstairs. As he breathed slowly in the dim lights of his room, he surveyed the contents. The window was slightly ajar, allowing the breeze to cool down his stuffy room. It was too warm for this time of the year. He glanced at the ceiling, counting the glow-in-the-dark stars that were stuck up, the same way he had done every night since Dazai had barged into his room and started sticking them up with no warning. Dazai had gotten a pack of 100 glowing stars and split the pack between the two of them, each getting 50. Chuya had 44 on his ceiling. Most of them never moved since he had put them up with Dazai. There were 5 on his mirror, 3 in the top right corner, and 2 on the bottom left. The last one was kept in his wallet. He had put it there since he didn't have anywhere else for it to go, not wanting to mess up the layout he had made with Dazai, and liking the asymmetrical design in his mirror. After a while of keeping it in there, he had went to the shop with Dazai once, and noticed Dazai also had one of the stars in his wallet. He had never taken it out, and last time he checked, Dazai hadn't either. It was like their version of friendship bracelets. Apparently, Dazai had bought them after they went on a school trip to a science center, and the two had spent majority of their time gushing over the astronomy section. Chuya obsessing over the chemical makeup of stars and Dazai explaining the physics behind everything. Chuya remembered that day well. They had originally been paired separately, but after Dazai's sweet talk, the people they were with and the teacher in charge, the people they had been with were put together, and Dazai and Chuya ended up happily sitting next to each other and sharing headphones on the way there, and then Chuya ended up being a pillow for Dazai on the way back. If anybody asks, no, he did not also fall asleep. He was just trying to still to not wake up the insomniac who was finally sleeping. Chuya's eyes grew heavier the longer he thought, being filled with a strange nostalgia he was not too unfamiliar with. Dazai's words of comfort seemed to have helped, however, the bit of anxiety around the whole soulmate business having died down. Eventually, he found himself drifting off, falling into a dreamless sleep. Chuya woke up on the Monday of the 29th of April with a headache and a weird tingly sensation over most of his body. He rolled over to turn off his alarm, sighing in the realization that it was finally his birthday. Slowly, he got up, blearily stumbling from his bedroom to the bathroom, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he grabbed his toothbrush. The taste of the spearmint toothpaste that he quite frankly hated was enough to wake him up as he turned from the cup with the toothbrushes to his mirror. What the fuck? Chuya choked on his toothpaste, side of aquamarine line on the back of his arm poking out from below his long sleeve. He spat out the toothpaste and rinsed the brush off, putting it back in the cup. He yanked his sleeve up, a wave of nausea rolling over him at the sight of more lines. He pulled the sleeve back down and stared at himself in the mirror. He hadn't even properly looked, just seen a few more. He looked a mess, his face pale and hair messy, his chin covered in the toothpaste he had choked on, and his eyes wide open. He left the bathroom in silence, ignoring the confused expression on his little sister's face as he entered his room, closed and locked the door. He looked in his mirror. He had purposely worn a long-sleeved shirt and trousers to sleep. That way he wouldn't risk seeing something the instant he woke up. It worked, I guess, Chuya thought. What the hell am I supposed to do with this? He swallowed, and in one swift motion, pulled off his shirt. He stared at the blue lines covering his arms from his shoulder to his wrists, the outside and insides of his arms. There was barely any bare patch of skin. At least my soulmate's favorite color isn't red, he thought, trying to pull a smile. He sighed, looking at the actual arms instead of the reflection. The blue had slightly different shades on certain marks and in certain areas. Some were extremely faint, while others were bright against his skin. He's seen soulmate marks before, of course. His parents have them, his older sister has them. Some of his friends have them, but it was different seeing them on his own skin. This was jarring, if not downright horrifying. What in the hell had happened to his soulmate? Scratch that, he had a feeling he knew already. Inspecting the lines closer was all he needed. They were clearly self-inflicted wounds. He knows about self-harm, obviously. He has friends who struggle with it. And there had been a time the year before, after he came out, that he had considered it himself. Still, the quantity and severity of these injuries was terrifying. There is no way I can go to school with these on display, he realized, quickly moving to find his school shirt and a hoodie to wear. It was really too hot for a jumper, but well, desperate times. He grabbed his uniform and a jumper, scrambling to cover himself. He had no clue who his soulmate was, but he was already extremely concerned. He shed his trousers in order to put on the rest of his uniform, and nearly gagged at the sight of more blue lines along his thighs. Oh, God, he thought, covering his mouth with his hand at the sight of those marks, appearing in an even deeper blue to the ones on his arms. He pulled his trousers on without a second thought. I need to speak to Dazai, was his next thought, grabbing his shoes and bag and pocketing his phone as he practically ran out of the door, much to the bewilderment of his mother in the kitchen, who called out "Happy birthday" in a futile attempt to gain Chuya's attention. Surprisingly, Dazai was already outside, leaning against the lamppost with his headphones on. At the sight of Chuya's pale and alarmed expression, his smile and greeting died. What happened? Dazai demanded instantly, falling into step next to Chuya as they headed in the direction of school. Chuya shook his head frantically, his hands clenched into fists inside his pocket. I don't even know. Well, I do, but... Chuya cut himself off, groaning in frustration. I woke up with a soulmate mark. Dazai's expression twisted for a minuscule second, but Chuya wasn't paying attention, practically vibrating with nervous energy. Isn't that a good thing? He asked dryly. Happy birthday, by the way, he added more sincerely. Chuya sighed, kicking a rock. Thanks, but it isn't just a mark, Dazai, he said, looking up at Dazai, his expression serious. Dazai surveyed his expression, seemingly understanding how serious this was to Chuya, and waiting for him to finish explaining. I am covered in marks, the entirety of my arms and my thighs. I didn't even bother checking anywhere else before covering them up. Dazai nodded instantly in understanding, holding out his hand. Chuya glanced around, double-checking anyone was there, then pulled up the sleeve of his jumper and handed his arm to Dazai. As they walked, Dazai gingerly held on to Chuya's arm, inspecting the lines, his face paling as he looked. Dazai opened his mouth to say something, then hesitated. Chuya looked at him worriedly, watching as Dazai thought. After a moment, he let go of Chuya's arm and nodded grimly. Definitely self-inflicted. Oldest is likely a week or so old. Freshest probably last night or early this morning. Chuya pulled his sleeve back down hastily, the amount of people around them increasing the closer the pair got to school. The confirmation that the wounds covering his soulmate's body were the result of self-harm was not much of a comfort to him, much less the fact that now he was going to have these marks all over him at least until he meets his soulmate, and likely for longer afterwards as well. He sighed, shoving his hand back in his pocket. What the fuck do I do now? He asked bitterly, not expecting an answer. Dazai sighed and shrugged. You wait, I guess. Find your soulmate, hope nobody asks too much about the marks, and try and continue as normal. Chuya scowled, kicking the ground. Yeah, I'll just go around all the potential candidates and ask if one of them have a proficiency for slicing their arms up. It'll be easy and not at all upsetting or rude, he said snarkily, and Dazai smiled slightly. I'm sure you would be fine doing that. You can withstand a punch. Besides, dogs like you don't understand manners, so I'm sure they'd forgive you. Chuya elbowed Dazai, and he yelped, jumping out of the way. I'm not a dog! Are you ever going to let that stupid pet go? He yelled in irritation, but he couldn't say that Dazai's usual teasing wasn't making him feel at least a little bit better. Dazai just grinned, skipping ahead of Chuya. Never! Chuya groaned but walked faster to keep up with Dazai. When Dazai noticed Chuya walking faster, he broke into a run, turning around to shout at Chuya. Last one to the school has to do the other's homework for a week. You're on! Chuya called back, not hesitating as he ran after Dazai. Like hell would he do Dazai's homework for him. Chapter 2. At the end of their third class today, Chuya marched over to Dazai's desk, triumphantly dumping his history jotter on top of Dazai's and sitting on his desk. Hope you like writing essays, Dazai,
he said with a smirk. Dazai rolled his eyes, but didn't complain when he put Chuya's daughter into his own bag, standing up and looking at Chuya with disdain. I don't, but I'm better at it than you, so maybe you'll finally get something over a 75 for once. Chuya scowled. Low blow. It's not my fault the words blur. Dazai blinked a few times, and then his eyes widened. Oh, I didn't mean it. It was supposed to be a joke. Did that hurt your feelings? I know about your thing with the letters. I wasn't meaning to make fun of you. It was Chuya's turn to pause and think. Dazai was apologizing? It was common for Dazai to not understand how something may affect another person emotionally, or to struggle to understand why some people can't put their emotions aside. But for him to apologize about it was weird. Not a bad weird, though. Chuya cleared his throat, slipping off Dazai's desk again. No, it didn't hurt my feelings, it just annoys me. Dazai nodded, and the two left the class, squeezing through the crowded halls as they headed for the art department. Chuya walked just behind Dazai, a firm grasp on the strap of Dazai's bag as people knocked into them left and right. The halls were so crowded and loud. His chest felt weirdly tight, and his head was hurting even worse than it had when he woke up. Dazai stopped walking suddenly, and Chuya, who hadn't been paying attention, crashed into him, causing them both to stumble slightly. Dazai pulled Chuya to the side and kept him there for a few minutes to wait for the crowds to thin out as everyone got to their classes. As their hallways emptied, Dazai continued walking through the halls, and before long they were both in their art class, the room loud and chaotic as people gathered their supplies and started work. The teacher was at his desk, ignoring the students as they made a ruckus, only stepping in to stop things from being thrown across tables, or to get people to mop up spilled water pots. Chuya sat in his usual corner table, a pencil drawing of art supplies laid out in front of him, his reference image propped up on his pencil case. When choosing their seats, Dazai had insisted on sitting across from Chuya instead of next to him. It had really hurt Chuya's feelings until Dazai had explained how he preferred to have a full view of the room, and he wouldn't have got that while sitting next to Chuya. He didn't believe him at first, because in some of their other classes Dazai sits with his back to the room. He had eventually dropped it, deciding that the way Dazai was hiding his coursework from him was far more interesting and important. Art was one of Chuya's favorite classes. Not for the environment, not for the actual work. Being honest, he wasn't even that good at art. He wasn't bad, he would easily get decent marks, but he wasn't great. No, instead he liked it because he got to see Dazai draw. There was something captivating about it. Even if he was trying to concentrate on his own work, he would find his gaze shifting to Dazai, and the subtle changes in his expression as he drew. There were more reasons, sure, but that was the most prominent. He was supposed to be doing his final piece, a still life of various art supplies from the room piled up on the desk. What made it special was that the majority of the background was going to be done in pencil, while each of the supplies, for example, paintbrushes, crayons, and chalk, were going to be done in their respective medium and color, bleeding into the pencil. He was very proud of himself for thinking of it, and Dazai had been more than willing to help him figure out how to exactly pull it off. Speaking of, Chuya looked up, glancing across the table at Dazai. Dazai was looking back at him, chewing his lip. The moment Dazai noticed Chuya was looking back at him, he let go of his lip and smiled, sticking his middle finger up. Chuya returned the sentiment with a scowl, and then turned his attention back to his drawing, loosely planning his shading. Weirdly, his hand was shaking. He paused, swallowing thickly. He put his pencil down. Now that he was thinking about it, his chest was still tight from when he was in the hallway, and his headache wasn't being helped by the noise. He closed his eyes, trying to push past the uncomfortable feeling. Just as he closed his eyes, he felt a heavy hand land on his shoulder, and another pat his back. Chuya! A familiar voice called, and Chuya flinched, opening his eyes and turning to look at Shirase, who hadn't removed his hand from Chuya's shoulder. Happy birthday, man! Shirase continued, his voice achingly loud. Yuan just smiled from next to Shirase. Thanks. Chuya muttered, slightly uncomfortable at the sudden appearance of his old friends, who had just the year prior declared that they never wanted anything to do with him again. Shirase was undeterred by the lack of warmth in Chuya's tone, speaking enthusiastically. Just wanted to check on how you were doing. You know we haven't hung out in ages. Whose fault is that? Chuya thought with annoyance, but he smiled, his migraine only getting worse. Yeah, it's been a while, was what he responded with. Shirase grinned. So, 16, huh? Did you get a soulmate mark yet? Shirase asked, suddenly seeming a little too interested. Chuya felt a wave of nausea wash over him, both at the tone Shirase was using and at the reminder of his soulmate mark. He should have known Shirase wouldn't have spoken to him again without a reason. Before he could respond, having had to pause to fight off his urge to puke, Dazai cut in, speaking in a forcefully polite tone. Yeah, he actually did. Did you notice your dad hurt his hand this morning? Oh, wait, you couldn't have, 'cause he left, Dazai said with a tight-lipped smile. The smile dropped and Dazai wrinkled his nose. Go away. It doesn't concern you whether Chuya has a mark or not. It certainly wouldn't be connected to one of your little gang members. Get lost, sheep. Shirase scowled and turned to leave, but not before speaking to Chuya one last time. You should really find yourself better friends, not ones that are depressed emos. You'll come running back when you realize that that thing you hang out with isn't going to benefit you. Shirase snarled before leaving. Dazai glared after Shirase. Chuya just sat there, numb. It felt like so much had just happened. He stood up abruptly, ignoring Dazai's surprised questions, and he muttered something to the teacher about going to the bathroom, and he stormed out of the classroom, practically running the moment he was in the corridor. He found himself in the bathroom on the top floor. Nobody ever used these ones because they were so far away, and right at the end of the furthest row of cubicles was a hidden one that didn't lock properly unless you lifted the door with your foot. He slammed the door shut and locked it, sinking to sit on the ground, dropping his head into his shaking hands. He was breathing rapidly, and his vision was blurring, tears gathering quickly. They dripped down his cheeks, his shoulders shaking as he tried to calm himself down. There wasn't even anything really wrong. He had slept fine. He wasn't mega worried about his exams. It was just his stupid soulmate stuff, and his stupid old friends, and his stupid feeling of hating change, and... The stall door banged. Chuya's head shot up, the small sobbing sounds he hadn't even known he was making stopping instantly. Fuck off! He snapped angrily, and the person who had knocked on the door responded in an annoyingly sing-song tone. No, Dazai responded, and Chuya groaned, recognizing Dazai's worn and beat Converse under the gap of the door. Let me in before I slide under the door. You know I will. Just don't want to get covered in dirty floor germs for nothing. Dazai continued. Chuya swore under his breath, but kneeled up just enough to undo the lock before slumping back to the floor and hiding his face again, this time in his knees. Dazai hummed his appreciation, closing the door again and sitting across from Chuya in the cramped stall. Chuya's breathing was still shallow, but evening out slightly, and Dazai reached to take one of Chuya's wrists. Chuya recognized the movement, the silence comforting for once as Dazai counted Chuya's pulse. Chuya took the moment to listen to how Dazai was breathing, matching it and bringing his breathing back to normal, causing his racing heart to slow again. Once satisfied, Dazai removed his hand from Chuya's wrist and sighed. Good now? Dazai asked quietly. Chuya lifted his head and nodded, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath as the last of his tears fell. He jumped a little when he felt Dazai's thumbs against his cheeks, and his eyes flew open, relaxing again when he realized Dazai was just wiping the tears from his face. They sat quietly for a few moments, Dazai's hands still on Chuya's face as he closed his eyes again. Eventually, Dazai dropped his hands and smiled reassuringly. Do you want to talk? Dazai got cut off by the bathroom door opening and a teacher calling into the room. Dazai jumped forward before Chuya could react, putting his hand over Chuya's mouth and as a result pushing him into the wall. It didn't hurt, but for some reason Chuya's heart rate spiked again, his breathing going shallow as he looked up at Dazai with wide eyes. Hello? Who's in here? Teacher asked in an accusing tone. Dazai responded quickly, putting on a sweet voice. It's Dazai, miss. I'm out on a hall pass. I wasn't feeling well and asked to use the bathroom. He lied smoothly, and Chuya broke out of his temporary stupor, licking Dazai's palm to get him to remove it. Dazai did so with a disgusted look, and Chuya glared at him. Alright, if you're not feeling well, I can escort you to first aid. And show me your hall pass. I'll wait in the hall. Don't be long. The teacher said, and Dazai responded with a quick, Yes, miss, before the door closed. Then, Dazai urged Chuya to sit on top of the toilet with his feet up, and began patting his pocket for a blank hall pass. Chuya watched Dazai scramble with amusement, his momentary panic forgotten. Dazai found two and quickly filled out the details, giving one to Chuya and keeping one for himself. We're skipping the rest of the day. Grab both our bags when you go back to art and then meet me at the back gate. I'll convince first aid to send me home. Dazai whispered, not giving Chuya a chance to actually agree before he was leaving and splashing his hands under a tap to sell his lie. Chuya sighed, suddenly feeling very tired. Now he needed to wait for a few minutes to ensure Dazai and the teacher had left. The rest of the day was sure going to be interesting. Chapter 3. Luckily, Chuya ended up not needing the fake hall pass, not running into any teachers on his way back to art, and the art teacher having not even noticed his or Dazai's absence. He ended up loitering at the back gate as he waited for Dazai to arrive. He had put Dazai's bag on the ground, his own on his back as he eyed the gate. It had been a while since they'd skipped via jumping the gate, but the school had fixed the hole in the fence they used to leave from. Still, he hadn't even waited for Dazai to reach him before scaling the gate and dropping to the other side, and Dazai had followed without a word. Now they were in the arcade, which was mostly empty due to most kids being at school. After completely destroying Dazai in a dancing game, they ended up sitting on a bench outside, indulging in the sweets they had got with the tickets they had won while playing the game. It was a pitiful amount, way less than usual, but Chuya didn't mind, and had a suspicion that Dazai didn't either, especially due to the fact that they had somehow mostly ended up playing games Chuya liked, or it could beat Dazai in. So really, the amount of sweets had nothing on the bragging rights. I can't believe you lost so many times today. I mean, come on, Dazai. It's like you weren't even trying. Chuya said teasingly, a wide grin on his face as he unwrapped the lollipop. Dazai just rolled his eyes, smiling slightly. Maybe if Chuya hadn't picked that stupid dance game, I would have won. He huffed dramatically. Hey, you said we could take turns choosing. If you didn't play on your strengths when you chose the games, that's your problem. Chuya retorted quickly, still smiling smugly. Yeah, whatever you say, dog, Dazai said, voice bored as he waved Chuya away. Chuya bristled and was about to shout back when Dazai interrupted him, checking the time. School's going to finish in an hour or so. It's probably alright to go home if you want. Dazai asked, glancing at Chuya as he grabbed his stuff. Chuya sighed and grumbled, grabbing his own stuff. Are you ever going to stop referring to my house as your home? He asked with feigned annoyance. Nope, Dazai said happily as they began to walk. Chuya rolled his eyes but smiled. Then he frowned, thinking. He hadn't been to Dazai's house in a while. A while was an understatement. It had been like a year. Hey, Dazai? He asked, tilting his head slightly. Dazai hummed, matching Chuya's head tilt. Yeah? Chuya frowned his eyebrows and hesitated. He knew Dazai's home situation was rocky, so he wasn't sure how Dazai would answer. Hopefully, above all else, it would be honest. We haven't been to your house in ages. Is there a reason? Dazai stiffened slightly, and Chuya quickly backtracked. I mean, I obviously don't mind. We never really went there often, even when we used to. And my parents adore you, and my siblings do. Even Koyo, she likes you. So it's not a problem. I'm just curious. Dazai opened his mouth to speak, and hesitated. Chuya waited anxiously, tearing his gaze away from Dazai to look at the ground while they walked. It was very quiet for a few seconds, until he felt Dazai shrug next to him, and heard him speak. It's just boring there since Oda moved away. I don't blame him, really. It was dull even before then. Chuya nodded slowly as he listened to Dazai talk. Being in Dazai's house had always put him slightly on edge when he was younger. From Mori's seemingly fake smiles and polished edges, to Elise's bubbly outbursts being silenced by a pointed look from the wrong person, he had always felt uncomfortable. Oda had been the most normal, and Oda had moved away a few months ago to live with his friend. Chuya could easily believe why Dazai would prefer being at his house, and why he'd want to avoid explaining exactly why. Your house is more lively. There's always some sort of noise or someone doing something. I appreciate it. Dazai continued. Chuya rolled his eyes again and put on a smile, elbowing Dazai. With the amount of your stuff you've left in my room, it's practically your house as well anyways. Dazai stood up slightly straighter and grinned. What can I say? I just made myself at home. Chapter 4. Chuya's parents were not pleased by their son and his best friend walking in 5 minutes before school ended, but they were let off with a sigh and a "please stop skipping school,"
Both of Chuya's sisters got in within the next hour, greeting Chuya as he sat in the living room watching TV with Dazai. Koyo had arrived and told him to close his eyes, saying happy birthday, dropping new earrings and some money into his hands and disappearing before he could open them again, not wanting to be caught in Chuya's inability to receive gifts normally. Kyoka had been slightly nicer about it, sticking around long enough to be hugged after giving Chuya a brown rabbit plushie and a handmade card. Dazai had watched with amusement at the way Chuya interacted with his siblings, feigning ignorance when Chuya glared at him. By dinner time, the table had been laid with plates and pizza, a few balloons taped to the nearest wall, and a seat at the end of the table for Chuya. It was rather dramatic, but a yearly tradition, and carried out at all the birthdays that happened in the Nakahara house. Chuya had smiled until his face hurt, forgetting about all the stuff that happened at school, or about the soulmate predicament, or anything else that could have upset him. He said it every year, but he could swear it was his best birthday ever, eating pizza surrounded by his friends and his best friend. His parents had worked together for his gift, explaining that for his birthday, during the next holiday they had prepared for him to get a license for a motorbike. At that, Chuya had nearly exploded from excitement, and he was riding that high all the way through the cake, and he only stopped smiling when he crashed face first into his bed, sighing tiredly. "God, that was amazing," he said, and Dazai laughed. Downstairs, he could still hear the rest of his family talking and joking. Dazai sat down next to him on the bed, and Chuya sat up again. Dazai had a few gifts in his hands, and wordlessly held out the first gift. Chuya took it, slightly cautious at the smirk Dazai was wearing. He shook it. It didn't make a sound. "What's in this?" he asked curiously, and Dazai's smirk just widened. "Open it and see." Chuya opened it quickly, ripping the wrapping paper and instantly glaring at Dazai at the sight of the black fabric. "A collar?" he asked incredulously. "No, Chuya! Why would you ever think that?" Dazai asked, eyes widening in mock disbelief. "It's a choker. There's a difference." Chuya pulled it out, running it between his fingers. He had to admit, it was actually really nice, the smooth fabric feeling nice and cool against his skin. He admired it for a second, and then put it on, glaring at Dazai. "Don't think for 1 second that this is me playing into your stupid dog thing," he said, though without any real malice. Dazai just laughed. "Okay, just take the next one," he said, producing another present and pushing it into Chuya's hands. Chuya raised an eyebrow but opened it quickly, a metal tin falling out. He paused, confused. What the? He opened the tin to find a fountain pen, with ink in different colors and a small pad of paper to test the colors on. His jaw dropped as he carefully took out the pen, admiring the color. It was nothing particularly special, in a brownish red color with silver details. He looked at Dazai, carefully cradling the pen in his hands. "I know how much you like writing. I assumed you might like something fancy to write with." Chuya just stared even more. He felt his face heat up, and he shook it off, clearing his throat. "You were right. Thanks," he said, feeling a little awkward about accepting the gift, and he put it back in the tin before carefully putting it on his bedside table. He turned back to Dazai to find another gift being pressed into his hands. "Really? How many gifts did you get me?" Chuya asked, genuinely surprised. "Just those 3, Dazai said as Chuya took the final gift. It was soft, the paper crinkling as the material inside gave way under his touch. He glanced at Dazai curiously before he ripped the paper off again, being more careful than previously. It opened into a black hoodie with red stitching. Instantly, Chuya pulled off the jumper he was currently wearing and put the new one on, adjusting it to sit properly. It was a little big, falling over his hands and hanging loosely, but perfect. Dazai grabbed Chuya's left hand and Chuya's eyes widened until he was pointed to the embroidery on the cuff. It wasn't the neatest, but it was their names, Chuya and Dazai, surrounded by a bunch of stars and golden thread. Chuya probably had a staring problem. He just stared, his mouth falling open as he ran his eyes over the embroidered names again. He must be sick, given how warm he felt, and the way he felt his face go red. Without thinking, he used Dazai's hand in his to pull him forward, and threw his arms around Dazai, pressing his face into his chest. Dazai made a slight sound of surprise, but returned the sentiment easily, hugging Chuya back just as tightly. "Thank you," Chuya said, voice muffled slightly by Dazai's chest as he closed his eyes tightly. Dazai laughed, and Chuya could feel Dazai weaving his fingers through the ends of his hair, playing with it a little. "It's the least I could have done. Happy birthday, Chuya," Dazai said, and Chuya could hear Dazai's voice in his chest and the rapid pace of his heart. He felt so happy, like nothing could go wrong. He clung to Dazai tightly as they sat in silence for a while, the most comfortable they could have possibly been in that moment. The silence was broken by Chuya's mom coming upstairs. She barely blinked at the sight of the boys huddled together on the bed, used to it by now. "Dazai, your father is here for you." Chuya instantly clocked the way Dazai stiffened up and his breathing stopped for a second. He pulled away, a little confused, but Dazai was smiling and got up when Chuya did. "Oh, alright then," Dazai said as he grabbed his bag. He went to join Chuya's mom in the hall, stopped to wave. "Bye, Chuya. See you tomorrow," Dazai said cheerfully, and suddenly his bedroom door was closed. Chuya sat, slightly confused and a little alarmed. He listened as Dazai chatted to his mom all the way down the stairs, and listened as the front door opened and closed as Dazai left. He was left, sitting on his bed in the hoodie Dazai had given him, still able to smell the strawberry shampoo Dazai used, and wrapping paper discarded on the floor. I think it's the first time since Oda left that Dazai had been picked up from here, he realized. He wasn't sure what to do with that realization. Still, he got up and cleaned the wrapping paper, putting his gifts away and retreating back to his bed. It was only just after 9 p.m., but he already had a goodnight message from Dazai. He quickly shot one back, then leaned back against the wall, chewing his nail. He caught himself moving his hands under his legs, and instead ended up chewing on his cheeks. The day had been interesting. From his soulmate Mark to Shirase to dinner with his family, it had been a roller coaster of emotions. Emotions he wasn't sure if he had the energy to shift through today. Something had shifted. He furrowed his eyebrows as he thought about it. He couldn't place it, but it was like he had noticed something, realized something, or whatever it was had become more obvious. He sighed and got up, heading down the stairs. His sisters were still awake, and by the sounds of things watching a movie. He was in a movie mood.
I tried.
Why? Why is it so difficult? Just because you don't like it. While your friend
Chapter 5.
and all the other guys had a reason or something you didn't like, do they? Or
Dazai lay in his bed. The room was dark and messy. The wall next to him was covered in glow-in-the-dark stars. But it had been so long since he left the curtains open that they wouldn't glow anymore. He ran his fingers over the cuts littering his arms, pressing into them, blinking numbly at the pain. Oda was getting worse. He was sick, very sick. Nobody would tell Dazai what he was sick with. He didn't need them in order to know that he wasn't going to get better. Now, Chuya had blue lines all over his body, blue lines that matched his eyes, blue lines in the various shades of blue Dazai adored, blue lines mimicking the red ones all over Dazai. The last thing Dazai had been expecting that morning was to find that Chuya was his soulmate. Well, there's still a chance he wasn't, and that someone else just so happened to cut exactly where he had. He likes Chuya. Chuya does not like him. Chuya could never and should not ever like him. Plenty of people have soulmates and never marry them. Some people even hate them. Mori had a soulmate and looked blatantly disgusted when asked about it. Him and Chuya should stay friends. He's not a good person to love. He shouldn't be loved. He was broken out of his thoughts by a crash downstairs, followed by crying. He threw himself out of bed and down the stairs, not even hesitating before stepping in front of the hand swinging to hit his sister. Elise cried out anyway, horrified at the familiar sight of Dazai being hit. A cup lay broken on the floor, and Dazai stared evenly at Mori before taking Elise and guiding her out of the room. He left Elise at the stairs before he returned to the kitchen and began to clean up the glass shards. Mori didn't even blink as he stared at the cuts over Dazai's arms. "Your stitches are getting better," he commented, and Dazai just dropped the glass pieces in the bin. "No thanks to you," Dazai said with a wide smile. Mori coughed. "You can't hide Elise behind you forever. You need to learn how to look out for yourself. That's the only way you'll make it in this world. Dazai rolled his eyes. According to you, the only way to make it in this world is also by sabotaging everyone else. I'll do what I want. Mori didn't say anything and let Dazai leave. He headed to Elise's room, finding her sitting on her bed with a blank expression. Dazai felt sick. She had learned that from him, most likely. "Are you okay?" she asked, and Dazai nodded. "I'm fine. It won't bruise, and I can cover it even if it would." He's slightly disappointed that it wasn't hard enough to bruise. Part of him wishes he had antagonized Mori more, taunted him into hitting harder. He deserves it. Though if he had hit hard enough to bruise, then Chuya might have ended up with a mark. He wasn't sure how he felt about that idea. He tried rather hard to keep the physicalities of his family dynamics from Chuya. It would make it harder to hide. "Maybe that's what you want," a traitorous part of his brain whispered. He ignored it. "Are you okay?" he asked, repeating Elise's question. She nodded. Dazai sighed and cast her one more glance before leaving. He didn't know how to help her. Not with this bit. Oda would have known. He closed his door and pulled open his drawer. He needed something a little more. Chapter 6. Chuya now dreaded getting dressed. He was in the same PJs as the night before, and the last thing he wanted was to see what injuries had been added to his soulmate's body. While brushing his teeth, he had noticed a faint blue tint to his cheek, and had spent a few seconds panicking over that before deciding his soulmate must have fell or something. After a few moments, he realized he was running out of time and really did need to get dressed. So he quickly shucked his shirt and trousers, and he went to change his underwear, pulling them down and gagging at the sight of the bright blue marks over the sides of his hips. Those had not been there the day before. He took a deep breath and pulled on his uniform, adding the hoodie Dazai had given him yesterday. He actually stopped to eat breakfast this time. Some toast set out on the table for him. His parents were nowhere to be seen, and the only person in the kitchen with him was Kyoka, sitting with a bowl of something chocolatey. She was a rather quiet child, but observant and artistic. As Chuya devoured his toast as quickly as possible, he noticed her gaze on him. He paused, looking back at her as he swallowed his final bit of food. He got up and put his plate next to the sink as she spoke. "Koyo left earlier than usual today, and Mom is still sleeping. I need help with my hair," she said, turning in her chair to look at Chuya. Chuya blinked, confused as to why she would ask him. "Where's Dad?" is what he ended up asking, eyeing the long black hair falling down her back. Where Koyo and Chuya had bright, curly red hair, Kyoka was the opposite, pin straight and near black hair. Kyoka huffed. "He did breakfast, and Mom normally does that because he has to work, so he's currently rushing to get ready," she said, now getting up to rinse her bowl and put it with Chuya's plate. "Surely you know the basics of hairstyling," she continued, looking pointedly at the loose hair falling around Chuya's shoulder. Chuya blinked. He had actually forgotten he had been growing his hair out. He sighed. "I can only really do a ponytail. Dazai is the one who normally does the things like braids." Kyoka nodded. She handed him a hair tie. "Try anyway," she demanded, turning around. Chuya sighed, but obliged, trying his best to gather her hair into what could maybe be considered a ponytail. After a few tries that only resulted in weird bumps and a broken hair tie, he gave up, groaning in frustration. "I can't do it," he said with annoyance, staying careful not to shout, not wanting to alarm his little sister. Kyoka just stared at the broken tie and sighed. "Dazai will be outside waiting for you by now. Get him to teach you," she said, pulling out another hair tie from seemingly nowhere. With that, Kyoka grabbed her bag and Chuya had to scramble after her, slinging his own bag over his shoulder. Indeed, Dazai was outside staring into space. He looked over when Kyoka wordlessly shoved the hair tie into his hand and turned her back to him. He raised an eyebrow at Chuya, who threw his hands up in defeat. "Koyo left early and I can't do anyone else's hair," he explained quickly, still annoyed at his lack of competence in hair-related artistry. Dazai snickered, already working out a French braid into Kyoka's hair. "Damn, Chuya, you really should take the time to learn these kinds of skills, you know. They come in handy," Dazai teased, and Chuya felt something warm curl in his chest. Jealousy, he guessed? Unfamiliar with the feeling. Maybe he's annoyed that Dazai seems to get on so well with other people. That must be it. It didn't quite feel like jealousy, but he ignored the part of him that pointed out the way his face felt warm. It's the sun. Dazai had finished the braid quickly, and Kyoka didn't leave like Chuya expected. Instead, her eyes went to the hoodie Chuya had on. "You'll get a heat stroke if you wear that all day," she remarked. She looked interested. She was smart, and for a moment, Chuya was reminded of Dazai when he was at her age, just without the perpetual unease that surrounds Dazai. Chuya shook that thought away and shrugged. "I'll be fine," he said dismissively. Kyoka blinked, tilting her head. "You're hiding something." She glanced at Dazai, her eyebrows furrowing. "You both are." Dazai and Chuya exchanged glances. "I can guess it's bad. You should probably tell Mom and Dad, or at least Koyo. I don't want to know, but you should tell an adult." With that, Kyoka walked away, the single braid down her back swaying slightly as she left. Chuya felt dumbstruck. Dazai looked amused. The thing was, Kyoka was right. A part of Chuya had been screaming at him that he needed to tell someone. There was a person out there who was covered in self-harm wounds. Adding to them, and Chuya was no longer sure what to make of the blue tinge to his skin when he had woken up, which had faded quickly. But he couldn't. He should, but he felt uneasy. How was he supposed to broach this subject? Who does he tell, and what does he tell them? What happens when he finds out who his soulmate is, and something that was supposed to be a secret gets thrown out into the open? The conflict was eating at him. He hadn't even noticed that they started walking to school until he almost tripped over a curb. He lost his balance and Dazai caught him, gripping his arm and pulling him upright again. He hissed in pain at the sudden jolt, and Dazai let go. They continued walking, and Dazai was seemingly too lost in thought to make a comment on Chuya's trip. Weird, he thought, not making much of it. Another part in his brain screamed something incomprehensible at him. His thoughts had been making a habit of fighting with each other. He was so confused. "There was more marks when I woke up, on my hips," he said, grabbing Dazai's attention. Dazai looked mildly ill for a moment before smoothing his expression over. The garbled thoughts in the traitorous corner of his brain seemed to feed off of the slight expression change, and Chuya ignored it again. Instead, his arm was grabbed by Dazai, who began poking at it through the cloth. When all he got was a raised eyebrow, he slipped his hand under the sleeve to poke at the skin. Chuya sighed. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked irritably. Dazai let go, humming softly. "I did some research, and some people say that their soulmate marks hurt to touch. I was trying to test that theory." Chuya recoiled. "By doing something that could hurt me?" he exclaimed, eyes wide, but not really mad. He would have done the same. Dazai paid no mind to Chuya's seething. "It wouldn't have hurt badly, just stung a little." Chuya scowled. "It's the principle of the thing," he retaliated, and Dazai snickered. Okay, calm down. Quit yapping. I'm so sorry," Dazai said, and Chuya kicked him. Dazai made a fake yelp of pain, dramatically jumping and wailing about being attacked by a dog. Chuya was so caught up in his fury and, much to his further annoyance, amusement, that he didn't notice the slight painful tingling on his left shin, right where he had just kicked Dazai. Chapter 7. Trigger warning for self-harm in this specific chapter. Please take care of yourself. By lunchtime, Kyoka's statement about the weather being too warm to wear a jumper was proven true. Chuya had spent the day feeling like his brain was melting and barely paying attention, so now, at lunch, sitting under the shade of the tree him and his friends spent their lunch at, he had the worst headache of his life. He sighed, rubbing his forehead and slightly cursing the warm weather that he normally loved so much. A heat wave at the end of April was normally welcomed, but he couldn't stand it now. He looked up again as Dazai came over with a bag of food from the nearest store, and he tossed a water bottle at Chuya before sitting down next to him, their backs against the tree. "Thanks," Chuya grumbled, sighing and instantly opening the bottle, taking a big gulp. Dazai's eyebrows furrowed in concern, and he handed Chuya a sandwich from the bag of food, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he just pressed himself into Chuya's side, the contact subtle but there. For some reason, Chuya felt warmer. Sitting around them, some of their other friends watched with concern as Chuya squinted in the light and winced at the sound of cheering coming from a nearby lunch table. Rampo, Yosano, Kunikida, Atsushi, and Akutagawa were all clustered together in the shade, eating their various food, and while the area was normally alive with conversation, it was quiet aside from the ambience from the other students. The sound of the wind in the tree they sat under, the loudest thing coming from their little group. Yosano glanced at Kunikida, who shrugged. Then she addressed Chuya as she started rooting through her bag. "You should really take that hoodie off. It's too warm and you're going to get sick," she said while moving to tie her hair up, and Chuya felt a bit guilty as he noticed the worry in her tone. He looked down at his hands instead of responding and unwrapped the sandwich Dazai gave him, feeling slightly nauseous at the idea of eating anything. His silence only seemed to spur Yusano on further though, so she continued. "I know you just got it, but I'm sure Dazai will understand if you take it off. Even Dazai isn't wearing a hoodie, and he always does," she said, and Kunikida nodded. "Yeah, if Dazai is too warm, we're all screwed," Kunikida joked, but it was impossible to miss the concerned strain in his voice. There were a few quiet laughs, and Chuya chuckled a little, but he felt Dazai shift next to him and cross his arms, almost defensively. Chuya's eyes felt drawn to the movement, staring at the white fabric covering the skin. Dazai had bandages wrapped over every inch of skin on his arms, and likely the rest of his body. Chuya knew this, but to actually see the bandages for once was different to just knowing that they were there. Dazai had started wearing them one day with no apparent or consistent reason. It started with a simple wrist bandage, explained as a sprained wrist, then eventually grew until it was full length of both of his arms and occasionally his eye or neck. Mori explained it as skin hypersensitivity when Chuya's parents had asked about it, concerned at the way a 12-year-old Dazai had fumbled while trying to say it wasn't important. Apparently, any contact on Dazai's skin, particularly his arms and legs, could result in pain and bruising. What Chuya didn't understand was why he covered them all the time if having something touch his skin hurts, or why it only seemed to affect other areas sometimes. Still, he didn't question it. He just knew Dazai normally hid the bandages under his clothes when he could, not liking the attention that they drew. So it really was a big deal that Dazai wasn't wearing a hoodie. Suddenly Rampo spoke, fully opening his normally squinted eyes. "You're hiding your soulmate mark, aren't you?" he asked, tone mildly curious. Chuya blinked in surprise. He had only started hanging out with Dazai's friends after his old friends had pushed him away, and while he had fit in easily, the intelligence which most of his friends, and especially Rampo, displayed was often surprising. His shocked expression was enough confirmation for Rampo, and Rampo raised an eyebrow, taking a few more seconds before his eyes widened further and he fell quiet, looking at Dazai with an unreadable expression. Chuya shifted and sighed. "Yeah, I'm hiding my soulmate mark," he huffed out eventually. Dazai tensed next to him, and Atsushi spoke up, sounding confused. "Why are you hiding it? Do you not like your soulmate?" Chuya shifted again and took a bite of his sandwich to avoid answering, looking down at the grass he was sitting on, suddenly very interested in the golden pattern of the sun through the leaves. "It's complicated," Dazai said instead, a surprisingly sharp tone to his voice. Kunikida nodded as though having a realization. "Oh, you guys don't want other people to know your soulmates until you're both ready," he said sympathetically, and Atsushi and Akutagawa both went, "Oh," in understanding. Chuya went red, mouth falling open at how easily that conclusion was reached and accepted. "That's not it! That shitty mackerel is not my soulmate! I'd never go out with him!" Chuya said quickly in response, and he stood up, crossing his arms. "I did not come here to discuss my soulmate. Let's go, Dazai," he said, and Dazai, who had been staring vacantly at the ground, looked up quickly. Dazai stood to follow and gathered their stuff, complaining as normal. "Chuya, you can't just insult me like that and expect me to follow. You're my dog, not the other way around." The whiny complaint was met with deaf ears when Chuya took the first few steps to leave and got hit by a wave of dizziness, and Chuya made a slightly hissing sound, effectively shutting Dazai up. He stopped abruptly, instinctively holding out a hand to try and grab onto something. When Dazai went quiet, all eyes moved to fall on Chuya, and he could feel them watching with various degrees of worry. "Chuya? Are you okay?" Atsushi asked hesitantly. Chuya blinked a few times, suddenly feeling very sick. his head hurt so badly and the world was spinning. His throat felt dry and he found himself wishing he had drank more water. "Chuya?" Dazai asked, taking a step forward, and Chuya shook his head. "I'm fine," he said angrily, voice wavering. Chuya started walking again, the world blurry and his hands shaking. Then he suddenly wasn't walking anymore, and his legs gave out under him. Dazai was quick to catch him as he fell backwards, and Chuya briefly registered Dazai's panicked expression, his eyes half closed and black spots dancing through his vision. Dazai's eyes were wide with panic and surprise, and his hands were on Chuya's face. Dazai was trying to get Chuya to respond, but he was just so tired he would much rather just admire Dazai. "He rarely looks so genuine," Chuya briefly thought, before confusingly shaking the thought away. "He's so dizzy." There was too much going on. A small crowd had quickly gathered, and Kunikida was trying to wave everyone away. Yosana was kneeling next to him, and he heard her announcing that someone was too warm and had fainted. "That must suck," he thought tiredly, and the last thing Chuya heard was Dazai shouting for someone to get the nurse. Chuya woke up on an uncomfortable table with a headache and an annoying buzzing in his ear, sickly fluorescent lights making his eyes hurt. He pushed himself up with a wince, groaning slightly as he shivered in the cool air, and he was instantly greeted with a pair of arms around his shoulders. A quick whiff of strawberry told him who it was, and he gave Dazai a one-armed hug back, the other one still holding himself up. "What happened?" he asked tiredly, and Dazai pulled away, seemingly have decided that Chuya was okay enough that it was safe to be an annoying asshole again. "You fainted. You know how slugs can't go on salt because it dries them out and they need water? It was like that. You were too dried out. Maybe I should carry around a doggy bowl for you to drink from. This way this doesn't happen again." Dazai rambled as he pushed Chuya's leg from the metal bed and then sat next to him, pressing into his side like he had at lunch. "A good owner doesn't let their dog get dehydrated. And I did try. You should have drunk more of the water I gave you. That was very alarming, and I had to catch you. For being so small, you really are uncomfortable to carry. I had to get Kunikida to help me take you here." Chuya sighed, rubbing his forehead and closing his eyes. Dazai's voice was ringing in his ears and making him clench his jaw, but it was better than the previous buzzing, which had faded when Dazai started talking. He took a deep breath as Dazai kept talking, tuning out whatever he was saying, getting to skip class to sit with him or something. As Dazai talked, he felt horribly tense next to him, and when Chuya heard the school nurse enter the room, Dazai jumped slightly. Chuya just took Dazai's hand in his, holding on to it, not entirely sure why he had in the first place. To comfort him, probably. "Calm down, Dazai. Chuya will likely still have a sore head." Chuya looked up in confusion at the rough and deep voice, squinting and taking in the sight of Mr. Fukuzawa, the principal, standing in front of him. "Mr. Fukuzawa? Where is Mrs. Alcott?" Chuya asked, wincing at the sound of his own voice ringing in his ears. "Miss Alcott is dealing with another student," Fukuzawa explained, pulling over a chair to sit in front of the metal bed he and Dazai were on. Dazai seemed to have relaxed slightly at the sight of Fukuzawa, just leaning onto Chuya's shoulder slightly, but Chuya kept holding onto his hand anyway. "How long was I asleep for?" Chuya asked, and at the reminder of why they were here, Dazai suddenly pushed another bottle of water into Chuya's hands. Chuya took it and opened it, letting go of Dazai's hand in order to do so, to which Dazai pouted dramatically. "It wasn't long, 25 minutes at most. There was a moment when you came out of it and then just fell back asleep," Fukuzawa said, watching approvingly as Chuya quickly downed half of the bottle. Chuya nodded, swallowing and then speaking again. "That's not too bad. I was just dehydrated, I think. Should be fine to go back to class." "As long as you keep hydrated, yes," Fukuzawa agreed, and he got up to close the door before returning to his seat. Chuya shifted uncomfortably, the air changing to be more solemn and apprehensive. After a moment, Fukuzawa sighed, the sound drawn out and hesitant. "Chuya, do you know who your soulmate is?" Fukuzawa asked, and Chuya's eyes widened with surprise. He glanced down at his arms, which were uncovered, the bright blue lines on view for anyone to see. He sat up straight, looking around for his hoodie, spotting it on the seat Dazai had been sitting on. How many people saw them? Chuya asked, his voice panicked as he glanced between Dazai and Fukuzawa. Dazai winced, looking visibly upset, and Fukuzawa sighed. Anyone who was outside when you fainted. Yosano had Dazai take your hoodie off because you were far too warm. According to her, Dazai wasn't going to do it until she said it would make you worse if he didn't. So I would assume he is aware of your situation? Chuya nodded guiltily, looking down at the floor, his feet dangling a few inches from the ground, whereas Dazai's shoes brushed the dirty linoleum with every swing of his legs. Fukuzawa sighed again. Chuya had never realized how often he did that, and his lips quirked up with amusement, but it was quickly shut down when Fukuzawa spoke again. I'm going to assume that you don't know. The school can't do anything to make you tell us who your soulmate is if you don't want to, but we are worried about whoever they may be. We can't force you to find them or tell us who they are, but if you do, we would like to be able to try and help them. Chuya felt sick again as he nodded along numbly to Fukuzawa's words. He wished that the school did have something to force him to tell, or a magical way of finding his soulmate. Then maybe he wouldn't feel so guilty, and he wouldn't have this internal conflict over what he should do. He nodded once more, and Fukuzawa stood up, walking to the door. That is all. Please, if you find them, tell a member of the staff. You are free to return to class now. If you feel faint again, then come back, and someone will arrange for you to go home. Chuya made a vague sound of agreement, and Fukuzawa left, the silence deafening as the door to the first aid room swung shut. Dazai got off the bed, going to their bags and sitting them upright. Chuya watched as Dazai fiddled with the patches Chuya had on his bag, moving to play with a safety pin, holding one on. Fukuzawa asked if I was your soulmate, you know, Dazai said, amusement in his tone. Chuya raised an eyebrow, and Dazai turned back to face him with a smile. Genuinely, he asked me about the bandages and if they were still for the skin sensitivity. Chuya laughed a little, drinking some more of the forgotten water in his hand before responding. That's stupid. Imagine if we were soulmates. Bleh, he said with an exaggerated shudder, missing the hurt that flashed across Dazai's expression. Yeah, Dazai said, swinging his bag over his shoulder. That's stupid. Besides, if I was, it wouldn't be cuts, it would be bruises. You know that. Imagine it, you covered in blue bruises. Chuya raised an eyebrow, a little confused at Dazai's tone. Still, he shrugged and slipped off the bed himself, grabbing his own bag. I'm assuming I was unfortunate enough to miss the end of lunch, he asked, grimacing as they left the nurse's office to the mostly empty main office. Yeah, we've missed the first half of English though. Plus, when I spoke to Mr. Fukuzawa earlier, he said that he'd tell our teachers we'd be late for us. Dazai explained in a sing-song voice as he skipped through the empty corridors. A student passed by, and her eyes instantly went from where they'd normally go, the bandages around Dazai's arms, to Chuya's arms, and the blue lines covering them. Suddenly, Chuya understood where Fukuzawa had been coming from in assuming that Dazai was his soulmate. They seemed an odd pair to most, constantly arguing and making fun of each other, yet jumping to each other's defense the moment someone else chimed in. They were more physically affectionate with each other than most boys their age, almost always touching or holding hands. The two would be sitting leaning on each other, or Chuya would sit between Dazai's legs and get his hair braided while they were both actively making fun of the other. And Chuya was also openly gay. It wasn't the first time people would assume they were dating, and now it wouldn't just be people assuming they're dating, but soulmates. Yuck. As Chuya thought this, he realized that the thought wasn't quite as sickening as he thought it would be. Maybe he's just so used to being around Dazai all the time that being soulmates wouldn't mean much. They'd just be platonically soulmates. That happens sometimes. Yeah, platonic soulmates. He'd never like Dazai like that, and Dazai would never like him like that. Platonic, 100%. They're not soulmates anyway, so it's fine. Dazai was right. If they were soulmates, he'd be permanently covered in bruises. Dazai has no reason to lie about what's under his bandages, and Mori has confirmed what they are used for. And while Mori may be unsettling, he's Dazai's father, a doctor, and has no reason to lie either. Chuya frowned, crossing his arms self-consciously as they came to the English classroom. Nobody noticed aside from the teacher as they slipped into the back of the class, heading to their normal seats, which were near the door anyway. Higuchi was at the table with Tachihara, and they both waved at him, mostly disregarding Dazai. Chuya waved back as he sat down, waiting for the teacher to finish speaking before he started speaking to his friends, who had already noticed his arms. Right, listen, it's nothing bad and you don't need to worry about it, he said quickly before Higuchi or Tachihara could say anything. It looks bad, Higuchi protested, reaching over to take his arm and inspect it. Is this from your soulmate? She asked worriedly. Chuya briefly registered Dazai getting up and muttering something about going to the bathroom, and he nodded in response to both Dazai and Higuchi. Yeah, my soulmate, he admitted begrudgingly. Tachihara took a sharp breath in, also looking concerned as he batted Higuchi's hand away from Chuya's arm. That's not good, mate. Your soulmate must be right fucked to do something like that, Tachihara said, eyeing the blue lines mistrustfully. Those look painful. Does it hurt? Chuya sighed and shook his head. No, it doesn't. At least it hasn't yet. Dazai did some research and some people said theirs hurt, so it might just be different from person to person, he explained as he shifted in his chair. Higuchi nodded in relief. That's good then, she said. Tachihara quickly chimed in with a scowl. I'd kill your soulmate myself if he ended up hurting you in his own self-hatred. That's not fair to you, Tachihara said protectively, his tone faintly disgusted. Higuchi looked slightly uncomfortable with the words, and Chuya also felt a bit weird about it. It wasn't his soulmate's fault that it might hurt him. His soulmate might not even know that Chuya had his mark yet. It's a good thing it doesn't hurt then, Higuchi said with a nervous smile. Right, Chuya? Chuya was about to respond when there was a sudden sharp pain in his left arm. He made a slight hiss of pain, pulling his arms into his chest and wincing. Ow! What the fuck? He nearly yelled, drawing the attention of other people nearby. Higuchi reached forward to take his wrist and pull it away from his chest, assuming he had managed to hurt himself in a way she could help with. Instead, Chuya saw her freeze, along with other people watching, as a clear patch of skin in the middle of his arm was split in half by a bright blue line. The pain died away in seconds, just tingling slightly, but Chuya felt sick as he watched another line being drawn on his skin like he was being painted on. The room went quiet quickly as people realized what was happening, most people aware of the original marks and Chuya's fainting incident by now. After 5 lines had appeared, it stopped and the tingling faded. Now that the spectacle was over, most people slowly looked away, whispering amongst themselves. But Chuya stayed frozen, staring at his arm with a pale face, feeling like he might throw up. Higuchi and Tachihara were dead silent, the three just sitting and staring at the new lines. None of them knew what to do or how to react, dumbfounded as their brains struggled to process what had just happened. Without saying anything, they all just turned their attention to what they had been previously doing. Higuchi and Tachihara returning to their work and Chuya just staring at the table. What the fuck was he supposed to do with that? The area that his soulmate had just hurt was a little itchy, his skin crawling as his mind replayed the memory over and over. The thought of his soulmate doing something like that. Unbidden, an image flashed to the front of his mind, of a brunette sitting facing away from him, and blood dripping from his arms. Chuya felt even sicker, shaking the thought away violently, causing Higuchi to look at him again. Before she could speak, Dazai had returned and dropped back into his seat, humming a song. Chuya jumped in surprise, and Dazai froze, looking around the silent table. What happened? Dazai asked cautiously, his tone giving away that he already had a suspicion. Chuya showed Dazai his arm wordlessly, and he felt Dazai's fingers graze over the marks. Ah, was all Dazai said, but he moved his hand into Chuya's, holding tightly. Chuya squeezed back, and after a moment he looked over at Dazai, who was staring blankly at the lines covering Chuya's arms, his face pale. Dazai seemed to be thinking about something, and he wished he knew what it was. After a moment, Dazai sighed and looked back at Chuya, smiling sadly. I'm sorry. Chuya did a double take, blinking in confusion. What? He asked, furrowing his eyebrows, trying to figure out what Dazai meant. What does he have to be sorry about? Being annoying? On behalf of your soulmate, Dazai clarified quickly. I'm sorry, he said, looking genuinely apologetic. Chuya rolled his eyes. What was with Dazai and apologizing recently? You didn't make my soulmate decide to hurt himself in the middle of my English class, he said, huffing slightly as he slid down in his chair, tapping the desk with his free hand. Dazai looked slightly ill and turned away, but Chuya paid it no attention. "I'll be fine, I'll get over it. I was just surprised," he said, shrugging casually, trying not to let on how much it had actually affected him. "It hurt me for a moment, though," he added, glancing at Dazai thoughtfully. "Your theory was correct. Just it only hurt for a moment while the injury was being made, so congrats on a theory well spun." Dazai met Chuya's eyes for a moment. Dazai had always been a master at hiding or downplaying how he was feeling, but he looked genuinely distraught over the thought of Chuya's soulmate causing him pain. After a moment, Dazai cleared his throat and spoke tensely. "I'm gonna kill your soulmate." Coming from Dazai, it sounded like even less of a joke than it had from Tachihara. Right on cue, Tachihara chimed in. "That's what I said," he hissed angrily. "I'm gonna kill that asshole. It's not fair for him to bring Chuya down in his own self-destruction." Higuchi hit Tachihara on the arm and glared at both Tachihara and Dazai. "Can you please stop threatening Chuya's soulmate? I get it, you don't want Chuya to be hurt, but Chuya can handle himself, and his soulmate is clearly very mentally ill. Threatening him won't solve anything," she said firmly, and Tachihara visibly wilted. Chuya cleared his throat awkwardly. "Yeah, thanks, Higuchi. I can handle myself, and I don't need you guys threatening my soulmate. Given the extent of these injuries, I should probably be grateful he's even still alive." Suddenly, it had gotten even quieter. Chuya hadn't thought it was possible for the atmosphere to get any thicker. After a few moments, the teacher called the attention of the class, explaining what the homework for the week was going to be. Dazai's hand left his own. A glance at him showed him to have crossed his arms and started staring at his bandages. Chuya tried to ignore how his gut twisted at the sight, and instead tried to think about how much time he'd have with Dazai doing all his homework. Chapter 8. Well, this was it. Dazai was completely and totally fucked. He dropped his face onto his knees, taking a slow breath as he listened to Elise chatter happily in the next room, and heard Ango's overly enthusiastic responses. He shivered slightly. The temperatures had dropped drastically through the early evening, and now sitting on the windowsill, he let the draft from the window blow right up his back. Oda coughed nearby, and Dazai winced at the scratchy and strained sound. He could tell Oda was trying to stifle the coughing to not scare him. He wasn't sure if he actually appreciated the gesture. It made him feel like Oda didn't think he would be able to handle knowing the truth. He decided that Oda was also doing it to not scare Elise. That made him feel worse. "Are you cold?" Oda asked, drawing Dazai to look up from where he had buried his face between his knees. "A little, yeah," he said with a nod, watching Oda stir some kind of curry in a pot. Oda laughed, and Dazai could hear the way Ango had stopped responding to Elise for a moment to listen. It made him smile slightly. "I get that. I'm cold all the time now. Nothing to worry about. It's normal, apparently, with the medicine and all," Oda said, and he pointed to a folded zip-up hoodie sitting on one of the counters. "You can borrow that. You're getting the bus home, right?" he asked, his forehead creasing with concern. Dazai nodded, shifting and reaching to grab the hoodie, pulling on it. It was slightly warm. It had probably only finished drying just before he and Elise got here. It smelled nice. Oda sighed in annoyance, tutting slightly. "Seriously, if it was just you, you're almost 16 and can get the bus alone. But with Elise, you shouldn't have to get the bus home alone with Elise at night." Dazai hummed in absent-minded agreement, his thoughts straying to the way Chuya had been staring at the table when showing him his arm earlier. "I mean, Dad can drop you off, but..." Dazai was snapped out of his thoughts, narrowing his eyes. "Who?" he asked, voice dripping in petty false ignorance. His anger was misdirected, and he knew that, but it didn't stop the pang of resentment at hearing Oda so easily refer to Mori as Dad. Oda was old enough to remember when Mori had been a decent person. Dazai didn't have that luxury. Oda didn't get upset at Dazai's anger, however, just restarting his sentence calmly. "Mori can drop you off, but he won't pick you up? It's crazy. I'd rather he get the bus here and had a lift home." Oda hummed thoughtfully. I'll let Ango drive her home, he decided. Dazai frowned. Isn't Ango supposed to stay with you in case something happens? He asked, trying not to sound too worried. Oda laughed a little again, shaking his head. I'll be fine for an hour while he drives you home. Dazai just nodded, his thoughts straying again. His arms burned. What he had done earlier hadn't been enough. He had gotten halfway through before remembering the possibility that Chuya was his soulmate. And then he had gone back to class and promptly had both his theories confirmed. One, that Chuya was actually a soulmate, which wasn't hard to figure out. And two, that his self-harm was going to hurt Chuya. Brilliant. But he couldn't risk hurting Chuya. I'm gonna kill your soulmate. His own words to Chuya. I'm going to kill myself. He had a warm bowl pressed into his hands. He blinked in surprise, looking at Oda, who had another bowl in his own hands and was sitting at the counter. Ango and Elise are going to eat and watch a movie together. I figured you had something on your mind you might want to talk about without the prying ears of your 12-year-old sister, Oda said with amusement as he started to eat. Dazai contemplated telling Oda for a moment, stirring the curry. It was more watered down than usual, and he couldn't smell the spice like he usually could. Likely for Oda's benefit. He probably struggled to eat spicy foods now. At least, struggled to keep it down. He wasn't very hungry, despite the way the teeth gnawing at his gut screamed otherwise. Chuya's my soulmate, is what he settled on saying. Oda nodded, unsurprised. That's great. I was going to ask, but figured you'd tell me. How did you know? Does Chuya know? Dazai just continued watching the curry as he stirred it. There was barely any rice in the bowl. It was more like a soup. Arms, and no, he said blankly. Oda made a soft sound of acknowledgement, looking sympathetic. And you can't tell him because... I don't want him to know. Dazai finished for him, finally taking a spoonful of the curry. It didn't taste bad, it just wasn't as good as Oda used to make it. It made him feel even less hungry, but he kept eating anyway. He's going to find out eventually, Oda said, his voice surprisingly soft. You can't hide it forever, especially not when you get your mark. All it'll take is one of your little play fights where you hit each other a little too hard and you both suddenly have matching bruises where you just punched each other. Dazai nodded numbly. Oda didn't know Mori still hit him and Elise was under strict orders not to tell. The self-harm was not his biggest worry. We still have a few exams. Our last one is next Monday, Dazai said quietly. He probably won't start worrying about who his soulmate is again until next Tuesday. He laughed, smiling slightly, his cheeks warming as he thought. Though Chuya is very persistent and stubborn, I won't be surprised if the first thing he does after sleeping for most of Monday afternoon and night is launch headfirst into a full-scale investigation. Knowing him, he'll enroll me as his secondary investigator too. Oda chuckled, raising an eyebrow, almost in disbelief. With the way you talk about him, nobody in their right mind will be surprised with the knowledge you two are soulmates. Dazai shook his head, wrinkling his nose. Chuya has no reason to like me. I know Chuya's type, and I am not it. Oda rolled his eyes, smiling fondly. You know, I remember when you and Chuya were around 8, and you were both loud and proud about the fact that you were going to marry each other when you were older. Mori wasn't very happy, but Chuya's parents found it incredibly endearing. You had Kyoka draw pictures of your wedding in crayon. I remember listening to you bickering over who had to wear the wedding dress until Koyo had told you that you would both be able to wear suits. Dazai didn't remember that. He wondered if Chuya did. He does remember when Chuya had first realized he didn't like girls, and gotten upset about how he was different, and not understanding it. He does remember finding Chuya crying behind a tree. Because it was dark, Chuya had always been scared of heights and refused to actually climb a tree without him there. He does remember sitting in the dark next to him, his nice trousers Mori had bought for him contrasting Chuya's ripped denim shorts that had been patched so many times that they were more patched than original fabric, and he remembers wishing they could swap. He had been so jealous of Chuya's effortless coolness, of his ripped clothes and baggy t-shirts, of his plastered knees and scruffy haircut. He had always been, and still was, jealous of Chuya, Of his clothes, of his way of speaking, of his hair, of his friends, of the way his grades didn't matter, and above all, of how Chuya wanted to be an artist, to pursue writing and poetry, and how his parents had stuck his first attempt at a proper poem on the fridge with a magnet in each corner, 2 stars, a cat, and a pretty fountain pen which had been Chuya's favorite. It had been right up there with Kyoka's drawing and Koyo's pictures, and when Dazai had eventually picked up art and drew Chuya a picture of him, he had stared at the place it occupied beside the poem with a new kind of hurt warming its way into his chest. Looking at his drawing displayed so proudly next to Chuya's writing had made him want to cry, and he hadn't known why. And he hadn't been able to stop himself from crying for an hour when Chuya's dad had oh so carefully hugged him when he was trying to ask why it was up there. He had been 10 at the time, and it was the first time he had cried around Chuya's family, and he could still count on one hand how many times that happened. More importantly, he remembered promising Chuya that it didn't matter if he never found anyone to love his entire life, because they could just get married instead. He had promised that if Chuya didn't fall in love, he wouldn't either. He was a liar, because it took Chuya ages to fall in love for the first time, and the entire time Dazai had been blatantly in love with him. He refused to recall what happened next, determined that it meant nothing, but he remembered walking home well past midnight with Chuya's hand in his, and remembered the gentle hugs and the relief on the faces of Chuya's parents. So he couldn't say anything in response. He stayed quiet, and after a few moments, Oda sighed. I'm sure you and Chuya will be fine. Now, tell me about the game you had been playing. Legend of Hyrule? Dazai smiled and rolled his eyes. Legend of Zelda, Oda. Oh yeah, that's the, green elf guy. No, Zelda is the princess. The green elf guy is Link. Why is it not the Legend of Link then? Oh my god. It took Dazai only a few seconds to struggle out of Koyo's firm grasp on his upper arm, and he heard her exasperated shout of his name as he ran after Chuya. Chuya was a bit faster than he was, but Chuya had run into the forest, not the field. He was embarrassed. He wanted to hide, not to run. Luckily for Dazai, at this age, Chuya was not very balanced, and he would be hindered by having to fight through the low branches and bushes. Dazai slowed, panting, forcing his breath to calm as he tried to think. Where would he hide? Cautiously, Dazai walked a little further until the trees thinned, and right in the middle of a small clearing was a big oak tree, the branches reaching into the partially cloudy sky and the stars shining down through the lack of leaves. Just past the big tree there was another one, slightly smaller and with lower branches, and between 2 of the thicker branches rested a slab of wood that he had found in an old dump site nearby. Naturally, Chuya wasn't up there. He was terrified of heights. Maybe if I could control gravity and I could fly. I don't want to fall if I can't catch myself, Chuya had said. If you could control gravity, I would take it away. Yeah, I'd be like an anti-hero. No, anti-superpowers. I would be an anti-hero too though, knowing me. Dazai had responded with a wrinkled nose. What's an anti-hero? He could remember Chuya asking, his voice clear in his mind. A person that does bad things for a good cause, or for a cause they believe to be good. Oh, I could believe you would be one of those. I would just be what you were, I think. Unless I could be a really good guy. Like a detective. We could be detectives, Dazai. That sounds super cool. You would be a terrible detective. You would be in the mafia. You'd be a bad guy. Hey, why do you get to be a detective while I don't? We should be able to stay together. Why can't we both be in the mafia? Or we could have a cool, what's the word for when the bad guys get good? A redemption arc? Yeah, we could get a fancy redemption arc and stay friends forever and then go from being in the mafia to being detectives and then retire with lots of money and we could go live in France or something. I would like that. Being detectives together? Being together, detectives or otherwise. Even if one of us was supposed to be the bad guy, I'd want to stay friends anyway. Of course we would. You would need to be around to stop me from being able to fly. You'd have to be there to annoy me. In every universe? In every universe. That conversation had happened while they fought to secure the slab of wood to the tree, Chuya firmly on the ground as Dazai dangled dangerously while fixing the rope in place. And now he could hear Chuya sobbing behind the tree and see his waterproof jacket where the fabric had caught when Chuya sat down. Dazai slowly went over, and Chuya jumped in a mix of surprise and fear when Dazai sat next to him, carefully unhooking Chuya's jacket from where it had been caught to avoid it ripping when Chuya tried to stand again. "Go away," Chuya muttered angrily from where his face was buried in his arms, which were resting on his pulled-in knees. Dazai copied Chuya's position and didn't say anything. After a few seconds of silence, Chuya pressed into Dazai's side and lifted his face slightly. "What's wrong with me, Dazai?" Chuya asked between heaving sobs, and Dazai tilted his head to the sky. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. He always knew what was wrong with people. When Chuya had pushed him from the slide, he had known his elbow was fractured before it even started swelling. When Chuya had tonsillitis, he had known from how Chuya described his throat hurting. He always knew. But this was emotional, it seemed, and he wasn't always sure with this stuff, and even then, he had no clue. Chuya just cried harder, so Dazai shifted so he could pull Chuya into a hug. "You always know what's wrong. Why don't you know?" Chuya cried, his hand making a fist in the soft fabric of Dazai's jumper. Dazai shook his head, and he felt like he might cry too. "I don't know. I'm sorry, Chuya." Chuya screamed quietly into Dazai's chest, not knowing what to do with his anger, and Dazai's bottom lip trembled, and he sniffled. "Maybe," Dazai started, being cut off by a hiccup and a tear. "Maybe I don't know what's wrong because there's nothing wrong. Maybe you're okay. Maybe we're okay. Maybe there's nothing wrong with us. Maybe you can be normal." "But we're not! But I'm not normal. Why can I not be normal?" Chuya retaliated, his tears now soaking through Dazai's clothes. "Maybe you're not. Okay, guess what? Big surprise. You're a freak of nature, Chuya." Dazai was just as surprised as Chuya was at his words, and Chuya pushed himself up to look at Dazai again. "What?" Chuya asked, and Dazai watched Chuya notice the tears on his face as well, and watched his face contort in confusion. "Why are you crying?" Dazai scoffed, surprisingly angry. Anger was normally Chuya's thing. "I don't know. Why are you crying?" he retorted. "Because you called me a freak of nature?" Chuya responded, baffled, but the tears had stopped, so Dazai counted that as a win. "So what? If you're so hell-bent on there being something wrong with you, why should I not comment on it? It hurts my feelings. I don't want to have something wrong with me." Chuya wailed, and the tears started again, spilling down Chuya's cheeks like a dam breaking. "I don't either, but you're saying there's something wrong with you, and if there's something wrong with you, then there's something wrong with me too. So maybe it doesn't matter. So what if you're the only guy in our class who doesn't like a girl? I don't either. So what if you get nervous around a mystery boy you won't tell me about? And so what if you had a dream where you kissed a boy? So what?" Chuya seemed stunned into silence. Distantly, Dazai heard a firework go off. Despite how sure he was, it was still a few minutes to midnight. "You don't like a girl. I don't like a girl. You dreamed you kissed a boy. I've never dreamed of kissing anyone. So what if you're a freak? Because I'm a freak too. And if we're not normal together. And maybe there's nothing wrong with that." Dazai sniffled, going quiet as his own tears fell freely down his cheeks. He wiped Chuya's away, making his fingers damp as they brushed over Chuya's red cheeks. Chuya coughed and his eyes lit up as another firework exploded into life. "You mean that?" Chuya asked quietly, shaking his hair out of his face. The two were likely a sorry sight, huddled together in the damp dirt of a dark forest near Chuya's house. But Dazai couldn't care less, as the Velcro on Chuya's jacket got stuck to the fabric of Dazai's expensive jumper Mori had bought for him. It was a stupid decision to give a 13-year-old kid an expensive piece of clothing. Dazai nodded solemnly. "I mean that. In every universe, remember? In every universe." Chuya echoed, voice sounding oddly odd. At once, a series of fireworks took to the sky, signaling the turn of midnight. Both Dazai and Chuya looked up at the lights, eyes wide with wonder as they watched the fireworks through the trees. After a few moments, Chuya cleared his throat and nudged Dazai with his shoulder. You've seriously never even dreamed of kissing anyone? Julia asked teasingly, and as I smiled slightly, his drying tears making his cheeks feel cold. You're seriously wearing shorts in the middle of winter? He retaliated, pushing back. Listen, I was warm, Julia said whinily, pointing and then grinning. Dazai chuckled, and the two went quiet again, until Chuya interrupted the quiet. Do you know what had kicked all this off? Chuya asked cautiously. Yeah, it was those kids at the park earlier, and then your parents teasing you about the New Year's kisses, wasn't it? Dazai guessed. Chuya nodded, almost guiltily. It was just... I had to try so hard to not react earlier, and then I didn't mean anything by saying I thought it was a stupid tradition. But then they were all like, oh, you'll probably change your mind when you get a girlfriend, and I just... They probably didn't mean anything by it. I'm sure if they had known how you're feeling, they wouldn't have said it. I know. I think it's just... I don't think I'd mind the New Year's kiss as long as it was a boy. And I don't know how I'm supposed to feel about that, Juya said, turning to look at Dazai with wide eyes. Do you think that makes me... wrong? Dazai paused for a moment to think. No, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I'd probably kiss a boy too. You'll just have to find a boy who wants a kiss. I'm sure it won't be that hard. I'll probably never find a boy I like who likes me back. I'll be alone forever. Dazai met Chuya's eyes and grinned. Imagine, Chuya the loser who never got a New Year's kiss. Chuya went red and glared at Dazai. Imagine, Dazai the reject who also never got a New Year's kiss. They both went quiet, the sound of fireworks still going off in the distance. Seriously, how long did these go off for? Dazai quickly pressed a kiss against Chuya's cheek, pulling back rapidly with a burning face and turning away from Chuya. There was a stunned silence, and Dazai risked turning back to face Chuya again, only to have the kiss clumsily returned, and he went even redder. Chuya huffed dramatically next to him, his arms crossed as he refused to look at Dazai. With a shyness Dazai was rather unfamiliar with, he nudged Chuya with his elbow. What? Chuya asked, his voice muffled by what Dazai assumed to be his coat sleeve. Dazai cleared his throat, the way his face felt warm contrasting the cold air surrounding them, and the snow that was beginning to slowly fall. New Year's kisses are normally on the lips, he said, trying to sound somewhat normal despite the waver in his voice. Oh, for God's sake, Chuya said with an expression, but it didn't stop him from turning around and grasping Dazai's face between his cold hands. Chuya lost his confidence quickly. They looked at each other with wide eyes, and that image of Chuya with red cheeks, wide blue eyes, and messy red hair with snow in it would be imprinted in Dazai's mind for the rest of his life, along with the oh shit realization. So Dazai bridged the gap, a fistful of Chuya's jacket in his hands as he pressed their lips together for barely a few seconds before pulling away rapidly. It was silent, the fireworks stopping as they parted as the snow got heavier. A few minutes late, but it's fine. Still counts. Dazai said confidently, ignoring the way he felt anything but. Yeah, it counts, Chuya said, sounding slightly breathless. Dazai swallowed, trying desperately to ignore the taste of the strawberry lip balm Chuya had got in his stocking at Christmas. He had never noticed how nice strawberry smelled or tasted until now. Now, if you never get a New Year's kiss again, it doesn't matter because you've had one, Dazai said firmly, and he reached for Chuya's hand, squeezing it tightly. And if you never find someone to love, I won't either. And we can just be friends forever. Best friends, Chuya added. Yeah, forever and always, in every universe. If it makes you feel any better, I think we're too young to be talking about love anyway. Chuya's only response was a quiet sniffle. We should head home. Chuya's house. Just a little longer, please. The slight sadness remaining in Chuya's tone was all Dazai needed. Okay. I'm cold. Dumbass, you shouldn't have worn shorts. Why are you giving me this? You're probably colder than me. A warm brown jumper was thrust into Chuya's hands. I'll be fine. Thank you. Next time you run away, bring a blanket. Dazai jumped awake, breathing heavily. His eyes adjusted in the dark to see the cluttered mess that was his room, and he slouched down, covering his mouth with his hand as a sob ripped its way out of his chest. He wiped the tears from his cheeks and curled up on his side again, pulling the blankets over his head. He felt incredibly cold. Chapter 9. Chuya marched over to his usual spot at lunch and practically threw himself down into the space beside Dazai, opening his bag and pulling out two things, his lunchbox and his English notebook. Instantly he got some puzzled looks, but he ignored them, patting down his pockets for a pen. By now, nobody looked at him weird for the uncovered blue lines on his arms, the shock having worn off within the first few days, most kids more focused on passing their final exams. Now that his exams were over, he technically didn't need to be in any of his classes, but he enjoyed the routine, and sticking around would likely help him for his next year anyway. They were already beginning to cover the material that he'd need next year. On top of the academic benefits for him staying in school, plus another symptom for him to note down for his impending autism assessment, it gave him the perfect place to meet up with his friends and begin the search for his soulmate. Next to him, Dazai wrinkled his nose as he inspected the extra sandwich Chuya usually packed for him. "Is there no ham on this, Chuya?" Dazai asked, sounding personally offended. "It's not a ham and cheese sandwich if there's no ham. Then it's just cheese." Chuya sighed, tempted to just ignore him, but after the realization Dazai just wouldn't eat it if he didn't answer, he nodded. "Yes, there's no ham on it. Kyoka had the last bit in her lunch yesterday, and I was not going to go to the shop just because you like your sandwiches with ham. Now shut your lactose-intolerant ass up and eat the damn sandwich." Dazai pouted, hesitating but taking a bite anyway. "I'm not lactose-intolerant, you stupid slug." Dazai whined behind a mouthful of food. Chuya rolled his eyes, opening his English jotter and going to the last page, uncapping the Sharpie he had found and titling the page, Chuya's Soulmate Suspects in bold letters. "Your stomach shouldn't feel like it's ripping itself apart after you've eaten ice cream, stinky-ass mackerel." Chuya retorted needlessly. Dazai's attention already shifted to what he had written. "Chuya's Soulmate Suspects?" Dazai asked slowly, raising an eyebrow. Chuya felt himself go red, and he pushed Dazai defensively. "Fuck off! Don't say it like that! What else am I supposed to call it? It's a suspect list. There's nothing wrong with calling it that," he snapped. Dazai just wrinkled his nose, not saying anything. Chuya sighed, deciding to ignore the air of skepticism Dazai was emitting next to him. He cleared his throat, drawing the attention of his friends. "Right, now commencing the first meeting of the, Chuya trailed off, thinking of a name. "Akutagawa, name," Chuya said, turning his attention to the boy. Akutagawa stared back blankly, mouth slightly open. "Investigative Task Force?" he suggested meekly. "Too boring, doesn't quite hit." Kunikida sighed, looking up from the homework he was doing. Trust Kunikida to spend his lunch doing schoolwork. "Do we really need a name? We're playing detective in search of your soulmate. It's not like we're official and chasing a murder or something," Kunikida said. "Just for that, you should call it a detective agency," Dazai said quickly, foregoing his mocking disdain towards the investigation at the opportunity to annoy Kunikida. Chuya glared at Dazai, but detective agency had a nice ring to it, so he amended his sentence, starting again. "Now commencing the first meeting of the Soulmate Detective Agency, with our first case, my soulmate," Chuya said, smiling slightly. It was nice, a rather childish take on a serious situation that was helping to keep him from freaking out over all the things he still didn't know. Next to him, Dazai jeered at Kunikida, reaching over to poke at him, while Kunikida just tried to ignore him with the roll of his eyes. Ignoring them, Chuya turned to the actual useful few of his friends. "Rampo, what's the best plan of action for this investigation?" he asked, and Rampo raised an eyebrow. "Why should I help you?" Rampo asked, sounding bored. "This is simple, trivial. I could have figured this out when I was half your age." Chuya scowled. Rampo was in the next year up, along with Yosano and a few others that Chuya knew. Rampo was planning on going to university after summer, leaving school with top grades in all of his classes. It was infuriating, knowing how lazy he was when it came to anything else. Seriously, how the hell is it fair that Chuya has to struggle and scrape by in half his classes while people like Rampo and Dazai and just about anyone else could at least pass easily? Dazai never had to try, and neither did Rampo. It just wasn't fair, and they never recognized how lucky they were. Start looking for people whose favorite color is blue. We know we're looking for a guy, so who do you know is a guy who likes blue? Rampo said, snapping Chuya out of his thoughts. His voice wasn't gentle, but it was as gentle as you got with Rampo. Chuya felt guilty for the direction his thoughts had went. He didn't actually know how much work Rampo put into his grades, and he didn't know for sure with Dazai either. They both lied over that stuff. Just as it wasn't fair that some people managed to get through school easily, it wasn't fair to assume other people just got good grades without trying. He took a deep breath and nodded. Yeah, right, I don't know why I didn't think of that, honestly, he said, smiling and trying to think. Who did he know? He came up blank. I can't think of anyone. Dazai is the only guy I can think of who likes the color blue, and Dazai can't be my soulmate because I don't have any bruises. Plus the fact that I actually hate Dazai's existence. Chuya said dismissively. That statement resulted in a few scoffs of disbelief, and Dazai, who had moved back to lean against Chuya's arm while eating, huffed indignantly. You could have left it after mentioning the lack of bruises. For the record, I hate Chuya too, and think he's disgusting and stinky. Also, I think the new t-shirt he bought the other day is too big for him, and should probably be borrowed by someone who'll actually fit it. Dazai said, crossing his arms dramatically, but dropping them back to his sides as he said the last sentence teasingly. Chuya glared at him, and elbowed him in the side. Absolutely not. It's supposed to be big, jackass. He responded, pushing his daughter to the side for now, and instead taking his lunchbox bag from in front of Dazai and picking through it. He found the orange he had packed after correctly assuming that morning that he wouldn't be very hungry come lunchtime. Dazai pouted childishly and whined. Yeah, but it's supposed to be big for a person, not big for an elf. Dazai said huffily. I know we've got you back for a few months before Santa needs you again, but that doesn't mean you need to drown yourself in fabric to prepare for winter already. Chuya exploded in rage, pushing Dazai off of him. Fuck you! I'm only 16! I'm still growing! He yelled, and Dazai snickered from where he'd been shoved on the grass. Yeah, I'm sure the circus will encourage that delusion. They might even give you some stilts. Dazai taunted, and he got rewarded with a smack over the back of his head. Dazai flinched and recoiled, panic flashing over his face as he ducked protectively, but it was masked as soon as it appeared, replaced by another pout. Chuya, that's mean, he whined, over-enunciating his words. Chuya had frozen, not missing the fear that he had seen written all over Dazai. What was that? Chuya snapped, not out of anger but panic, noting the slight tension to Dazai's shoulders. Dazai blinked in well-feigned confusion and tilted his head. What was what? He asked, shifting back to sit leaning against Chuya again. Chuya caught his teeth on his lip, studying Dazai's expression, which was rather hard to do with the jerk practically melting into his side with his eyes closed. That reaction, he said, not quite ready to let it go yet. You've never reacted to me hitting you like that before. Chuya only realized how bad that sentence sounded after he had said it, but it was too late to change it. He never hit Dazai with the intention of causing pain, and he trusted Dazai to mention if it was actually sore. Regardless, either that was the first time Dazai reacted like that, or the first time he had noticed it. He didn't like how that made him feel. Dazai shrugged. You've gotten strong, Chuya. You're a fighter now. I was concerned. You could really hurt me now if you wanted, Dazai said dramatically. I can't knock you off balance while we're sitting down. Chuya frowned. He supposed that made sense. He was steadily getting stronger than Dazai, despite Dazai's height difference. While Chuya was slightly more careful with ensuring he ate healthily, he wouldn't be surprised if Dazai only ate when he was told. That was the main difference between them, and Dazai had always seemed to target his balance when they were play fighting. He hated the idea that Dazai thought he would hurt him. Just as he thought that, Dazai spoke again. I don't think you'd actually do it. I'm not scared of you. Why the hell would I be scared of my own dog? You're very well behaved, never barking at the other dogs, you don't bite, Dazai said with amusement, leaning his head on Chuya's shoulder. When Dazai spoke, Chuya shoved the incident into the steadily growing collection of things he needed to think about but never wanted to. He was going to need one dictated to Dazai soon. Whatever, Chuya said with a sigh, just returning his attention to the orange, rolling it on the plastic lid of his lunchbox. I'm not your dog. When he went to hand the orange to Dazai, Dazai's hand was already reaching out for it, the routine with oranges perfected by now. Dazai didn't like oranges much, but he liked how they smelled. Chuya loved oranges, but he couldn't stand the way his hand would smell like citrus for hours afterwards. So, Chuya rolled the orange to get the juice flowing because Dazai would always forget. Dazai would then peel the orange, splitting it in half and stealing a few pieces when he wanted. Chuya watched Dazai turn the orange over and pull out the stem, and watched Dazai press his thumbs into the resulting dent in the peel. Dazai's hands were nice, smaller than his but with long and thin fingers. Piano-playing hands, Chuya's mother had said. Dazai's knuckles were permanently red, and it made his skin look paler than it was. Chuya cleared his throat, forcing his gaze away from the motion of Dazai's skilled fingers pushing into the orange, pulling the skin off in a practiced movement. Dazai took 2 of the orange slices before handing the rest back to Chuya, not showing any manners as he shoved both slices in his mouth at the same time, barely swallowing them before licking the juice from his fingers. God, why was he so focused on what Dazai was doing? On his hands, on the slight wrinkle of his nose at the orange texture, on his lips as he licked the juice, on the smirk and the slight flush on Dazai's face as he caught Chuya staring. Problem, Chuya? Dazai asked, voice teasing. Chuya looked down at the peeled orange in his hands, his face burning. Just how disgusting you are. You've gotten your germs all over my food. I hope you plan on washing your hands. Chuya muttered, voice annoyed. Dazai grinned, wiggling his fingers at Chuya, pretending to poke him. Not until I've covered you in germs too. Watch out, I'll infect you with intelligence and then all your personality will disappear. Chuya scoffed and put the lid back on his lunchbox. Fine then, I did have those homemade crab cakes you like, but if your hands are so dirty, I can't give you any. Dazai's eyes widened, and the next second he was standing up, a wide grin on his face. I'm not a child, you don't need to bribe me to wash my hands, Dazai said, and Chuya just looked up at him with a raised eyebrow. He had paused in closing the lunchbox, but when Dazai didn't move, he clipped one of the sides into place. Dazai instantly shook his head and started walking backwards towards the school building. No, don't close it, I'm going. Dazai protested, and then he turned to run, shouting, I'll be back, I'll be back. Chuya rolled his eyes, but smiled, unclipping the lid again. He looked up to find Rampa and Yosano's eyes on him, both looking unimpressed. What? He asked cautiously, wondering if he'd done something wrong. Yosano sighed. Nothing. You're just oblivious, Rampa added. Chuya shook his head. Whatever, he's not oblivious. There's nothing to be oblivious to. Dazai left his phone behind, and it lit up with a message. The lock screen was a picture of them both, which was taken in the previous summer, the 2 of them capturing the moment before Chuya pushed Dazai into a river out of annoyance and got pulled in with him. The message was from Dazai's older brother, Oda. It was simple, just, have you told him yet? So Chuya wasn't that interested. There was nothing to be oblivious to. A few minutes before the end of lunch, Chuya was walking with Dazai through the halls of the bottom floor, just wasting time before class started again. He sighed, stretching his arms above his head as he walked. Seriously, I just want sleep. I'm exhausted, Chuya complained, lowering his arms again. Dazai hummed in agreement, yawning. The heat's making me tired, Dazai said, shrugging. Maybe I'll sleep after school. I'm coming to yours, by the way. Won't get anything done if I'm home tonight. Chuya was about to respond as they walked past a group of boys, and he got interrupted by a shout. Emo! One of the boys called, and they both stopped, and Chuya looked at Dazai in confusion. Sure, Dazai had the bandages, and Chuya's fashion and music taste certainly leaned that way, but he'd never been called that in such a demeaning way before. Egged on by the fact that they stopped, another one of the boys chimed in. The slur was met with cheers from the rest of the group, and dead silence from anyone else in the hall. Chuya clenched his fist and turned around to face the boys. There was no doubt they were talking to him now. "The fuck did you just call me?" he snapped, and Dazai put a hand on his shoulder, a warning. The boys laughed, pushing each other, clearly finding Chuya's reaction hilarious. The boldest of the bunch, the one to first say the slur, stepped forward. "An emo? Did you not hear me? Are you deaf as well?" he said, smirking cockily. Chuya returned the smirk with a withering glare. "No, I heard you. Just wanted to give you a chance to take it back." Chuya hissed, absolutely furious. He hadn't been called that for months now, and he was unbelievably horrified to hear it again. He almost forgot how much that word hurt. The boy was unfazed, spurred on by the cheers and encouragement his friends were giving. "Why? What are you gonna do? Call your boyfriend? Your soulmate, maybe?" he taunted. Chuya froze, torn between the new level of rage he didn't know he could access and the cold reminder that everyone knew about his soulmate. Dazai tried to pull Chuya away, hand still firmly on his shoulder. "Chuya, let's go," Dazai said, voice cold. Chuya shook his head, brushing his hand off, and instead stepping forward, pointing his finger at the asshole who was speaking to him. "Talk about my soulmate again. I fucking dare you." The boy froze up, momentarily scared, until one of his friends said something undistinguishable. He then smirked again, crossing his arms. "You know, I hope your soulmate kills himself." Chuya froze again, but this time he wasn't torn, just completely shocked and horrified. How the fuck could anyone think that was okay to say? Chuya was jerked back by Dazai, a small crowd having gathered by that point. "Chuya, let's go!" Dazai said again, his voice more urgent this time. Chuya was about to try and protest, about to punch this fucker square in the face when he spoke again. "Your soulmate might as well, having you for a partner. It's probably your fault he's cutting himself up. Maybe if you your soulmate won't need to. You should do it." There was an uncomfortable silence for a second or two, which Chuya spent engraving the words into his brain and fighting back tears. What the fuck? Then the silence was broken by a loud smack sound, and Chuya realized Dazai's hand was no longer on his arm. Dazai, Chuya realized with horror, had punched the boy, who had a hand pressed against the side of his face with wide eyes. Naturally, the kid's response was to fight back, throwing a punch back towards Dazai, aiming for his stomach, but Dazai dodged it, predicting the move easily, instead lifting a knee into the boy's ribcage as he lunged forward. A teacher was already running over, but Dazai wasted no time in punching once more, in the center of the boy's face, and the crack sound was enough evidence of a broken nose, even before the kid fell backwards, blood already pouring from his face. The boy stumbled, tears in his eyes as the teacher pulled him away. Still, putting on a brave front in front of his friends, he glared at Chuya, wiping the blood from his nose. "Get your fucking dog," he spat. "Put it on a leash." The boy was already being led away by a teacher, and another was coming over, likely to get Dazai. Chuya just stood there, stunned and hurt and angry. What the fuck had just happened? Dazai was still seething, his hands clenched into fists and his knuckles redder than usual. His fingers, which less than an hour ago had been covered in orange juice, were now spattered with blood. The teachers were more focused on the boy with the broken nose, and Dazai turned back to face Chuya, his eyes wide, likely as he properly comprehended what he had done. "What the fuck was that?" Chuya snapped, stepping forward to Dazai, uncaring of the second flinch he had caused that day. He told you to..." Dazai said back, not expecting the aggression from Chuya. "Did you expect me to just let him talk to you like that?" "I expected you to let me fight my own fights. Jesus, Dazai, I had it under control. What happened to leaving?" Chuya responded, his own hands and fists, as he looked up at Dazai angrily. This had been his own fight. Dazai hadn't even been brought up. There was no reason for Dazai to step in. "You did not have that under control. You froze up. He deserved that," Dazai protested, and Chuya groaned in frustration. "So what? He's got a broken nose now, and you're going to get in shit tons of trouble," Chuya snapped. "For someone so intent on referring to me as their dog, you certainly act like one. I don't need a guard dog. I can handle myself." It was Dazai's turn to freeze up. Dazai hated dogs, and Chuya doubted he had heard what the boy had said. And if he had, he likely hadn't paid attention. But it probably hurt hearing it from Chuya. Still, Chuya was still too angry to be thinking about what might or might not hurt Dazai's feelings. God, Dazai, don't fight for me. You're acting like some kind of overprotective boyfriend, and the last thing I need right now is you getting suspended. Dazai, in an attempt to deflect, smiled slightly. Maybe I want to be an overprotective boyfriend. Then find someone else to fawn over. Chuya snapped, furious at Dazai's inability to take this seriously. The comment hurt so much more than he thought it would have, making something ugly twist in his stomach and come up in the form of scathing words. I don't like you like that, and I don't need you. I don't need a protective boyfriend. I need a friend who isn't going to blindly throw himself into a fight he told me not to get into. You could have gotten hurt, and you're going to get in trouble. Well fucking done. I'm so grateful you punched that kid for me. Chuya said, the sarcasm clear in his tone. Dazai was standing still, his expression impassive as he listened to what Chuya was saying, but there was slightly a distant look in his eyes, like he wasn't fully there. Wow, that's a rather harsh rejection, Chuya. Dazai said blankly. Chuya scoffed, rolling his eyes. You would never be serious with a statement like that. I don't like you and you don't like me. We'll never be more than friends. Don't get any ideas. You're not my soulmate. Dazai nodded and smiled. You're right. We'd be horrible together. I'm sorry, Chuya. I'll just let the next person call you slurs and then tell you to... Chuya narrowed his eyes. Wash your fucking hands, he snapped, and Dazai looked down at the blood on his knuckles. And don't bother coming over tonight, Chuya added, and Dazai scoffed. Like I'd want to. With that, a teacher came and took Dazai away, leaving Chuya to stand in the quickly emptying hallway, no less hurt and angry than he had been. Dazai got an in-school suspension as well as library duties during lunch. Kunikida said with a sigh, sitting down on a chair. Chuya, Kunikida, and Akutagawa had invaded an empty music room after the fight at lunch. It had originally just been Chuya and Akutagawa, but Kunikida, as head of their year and a friend of Dazai's, had been dragged into the meeting discussing what had happened after Chuya had told the teacher who had asked him to come to fuck off and tell Dazai to shove his scrawny ass into the nearest bin, and therefore Kunikida had an excuse to be out of class. Chuya had only been let off because most teachers were quickly informed of exactly what the boy Dazai had punched said to him. That was probably the only reason that he wasn't stopped, as he had stormed his way into Akutagawa's classroom and snatched him, and why he hadn't been stopped when he, in no means quietly, invaded the music department. For how long? Chuya found himself asking, despite how he did not care. He never wanted to see Dazai's stupid bandaged ass again, at least until Dazai learned to keep his nose where it belonged. Kunikida sighed, pushing his glasses up his nose bridge. Just for the rest of the week. He's being let off lightly given the colorful interaction that happened before the actual fight. Kunikida paused for a moment, shifting uncomfortably. His father was also called, to be informed of the events and to come and collect him. That revelation made a wave of nausea come over Chuya for some reason. He didn't know why it made him so uncomfortable, but he wasn't happy about that. He could hate Dazai without wanting whatever he wasn't wanting to happen. I do not like Dazai's father, Akutagawa said, surprising Chuya and Kunikida. At least he wasn't the only one who felt bad about him. Kunikida hesitated before speaking. Dazai seemed off when he was told his father was going to be called. Dazai's never anything other than happy and enthusiastic, even when he's not wanting to be someplace. He doesn't tend to show his discomfort, but... He froze. Chuya finished for him. Kunikida wasn't surprised by his sentence being finished, and nodded. I think I was the only one that noticed, aside from Mr. Fukuzawa. Nobody said anything, though. Mr. Fukuzawa knows Dazai's father, apparently. At least, used to. He asked Dazai how his father was doing. Dazai had just shrugged. Chuya shook his leg, playing with the fabric of his trousers. He does this thing. Dazai, I mean. He does this thing where he goes distant. It looks like he's not actually paying attention to anything that's happening. Like he's not quite there. Did he? Kunikida nodded. Yeah, after he was told his father was going to be called. I didn't see much. I was told to leave not long later. but I've noticed he does that a lot. The room fell quiet for a few minutes, and the door to the room opened, and Shirase walked in, mostly ignoring them as he went to grab a guitar from the wall. Chuya winced, a sudden pain shooting across his back and shoulders, and then radiating across the back of his head. It disappeared quickly, so he disregarded it. In an attempt to break some of the tension, Kunikida spoke again. Do you not think you're overreacting slightly with the entire I hate Dazai thing? Chuya bristled and sat up straight where he was on one of the tables. Absolutely not. That fucking jackass needs to learn where the fuck he does and doesn't belong. That was my fight, he snapped. I also believe your anger must be misdirect. Akutagawa was cut off by another rant from Chuya. Listen, the asshole is weak as fuck, and any kind of injury he will get will be twice as bad because of his kin thing. He is a fucking idiot and needs to learn what he should and shouldn't do. What if he got hurt? He can't just blindly throw himself into a fight like that. I would have punched the kid myself if Daza had just waited a few seconds. Now he's got a suspension. Besides, he's annoying and ugly and a jackass, and he never brushes his hair, and he always steals my lunches, and he's always in my personal space, and always steals my clothes, and leaves his empty cups on my desk, and is overall a problem. He's infuriating and a problem. He's annoying and swings between being the most extroverted asshole to exist to begging me to go home because he's not having fun anymore. He is the most unpredictable, cocky, arrogant asshole I have ever had the displeasure of laying my eyes on. There was a snicker from the corner of the room, and Chuya's gaze snapped to Shirase, who was watching Chuya's rant. Shirase smirked, and Chuya's blood boiled before he can even speak. Finally realized how useless being friends with Dazai is? Shirase asked, putting a hand on his hip, the other one holding the guitar he was supposed to be getting. Fuck off, Shirase, Chuya snapped, annoyed that he was interrupting his cathartic anti-Dazai rant. Shirase shrugged. I'm just saying, there are plenty more reasons for you to hate Dazai than what you're mentioning. Really? Chuya challenged, narrowing his eyes. Yeah, Shirase responded, taking the bait. Like his hair, which you mentioned, it's a mess. I doubt he ever washes it. He doesn't look like he brushes his teeth either. His bandages make him look like a freak. Plus, he's been wearing the same shoes for like a year now. They're falling apart. His dad's well off, so he probably chooses to look like he only has 2 pairs of trousers. Chuya wasn't sure what he was expecting, but that was not it. It was clear Kunikida and Akutagawa hadn't been expecting that either, both looking as shocked as Chuya felt. Shirase continued, unbothered. One of my friends lives on Dazai Street. There's a little rumor that his dad hits him. She caught it through a window, apparently. Maybe that's the reason he dresses like some kind of neglected orphan. Because his dad hates him and his mom left him. Chuya was on his feet before he knew what he was doing, but Kunikida was just as fast, firmly pulling him back. Get the fuck out! Chuya snapped. How dare you speak about Dazai like that? You have absolutely no right to talk about anyone like that. And how fucking dare you speculate and make a joke about how Dazai's dad may or may not treat him? Get the fuck out! Chuya yelled. Shirase jumped and left quickly, well aware of the events that had already transpired that day, while Chuya internally pictured himself punching the fuck out of Shirase from 50 different angles. How dare you speak like that? Chuya snapped at nobody in particular, shaking Kunikida's hand off. Nobody speaks about Dazai like that. Who the fuck does he think he is? Chuya settled back on the table, still furious, and Kunikida cleared his throat. While I agree that was extremely unwarranted on Shirase's part, and you have every right to be mad, you were 2 seconds away from beating the hell out of him, Kunikida said slowly. Chuya scoffed. Of course I was. Why the fuck would I let him talk about Dazai like that without doing something about it? You should have let me smack the stupid smirk off his face. I think you screaming at him was enough for that. Akutagawa interjected wryly, his comment rewarded with a glare. Kunikida sighed and put his forehead on his palm. Okay, Chuya, he said firmly. What is it that you hate about Dazai this time? He asked. Chuya raised an eyebrow. He thought he had made that pretty clear. Because Dazai needs to learn which fights are his, and there was no need for him to pick a fight with the guy who was insulting me. Kunikida nodded and looked at him, talking slowly like he was speaking to a child. And why did you try to pick a fight with Shirase? Because he was insulting Dazai. Kunikida looked like he might burst a blood vessel any second now. So, you're mad at Dazai because he fought someone who insulted you, and you just tried to fight someone who insulted Dazai, he said. Chuya took a moment, pausing to think over Kunikida's sentence. No, that can't be right. Chuya slowly looked up, a look of horror on his face. Fuck, he whispered. Kunikida nodded in relief, and Akutagawa sighed in disappointment. Holy shit, I was so mad at him. I was such an asshole, Chuya said, dropping his head into his hands. Kunikida came to stand next to him and patted his shoulders. In that case, you should probably apologize. I told him not to bother coming over after school. The wince from Kunikida was audible, a sharp intake of breath. You really were mad? Chuya nodded guiltily, feeling ill as he thought back to what he said. He couldn't even remember half of it. He'll be in the library at lunch tomorrow. I'm sure he can apologize then, Kunikida said with a sigh. Chuya just nodded again, feeling dread pool in his stomach. He fucked up. Despite knowing Dazai went home, Chuya still waited for him at the gate when school ended, and looked forward to speak to him multiple times on the way home. And despite knowing he had told Dazai not to bother coming over, he still spent most of the evening waiting for Dazai to burst through the door. And lastly, when his goodnight message didn't even get through to Dazai's phone, he fell asleep with tears on his face. Chapter 10. The teachers had started slowly filing out of Fukuzawa's office a few minutes after Kunikida left. Apparently, Chuya had ran off somewhere, probably the practice room in the music department hidden behind the shelves with the spare string instruments. There were plenty of things he and Chuya had in common. Their appreciation for hidden rooms and small spaces was one of them. Since Chuya had shouted at him, he had been warding off the brain fog like a disease, trying to prevent the sickeningly familiar feeling of his vision blurring and thoughts shutting down from happening. He had let it earlier, and he had slipped up when he was told Mori was going to be called, but he needed to be alert, or alert enough. Eventually, Dazai and Fukuzawa were left alone, and Fukuzawa gave him a pleasant smile. Would you like a sweet? If I remember correctly, you have quite the sweet tooth, Fukuzawa offered, moving to open a drawer. No thanks, Dazai responded quickly, his arms crossing defensively. The idea of eating made his stomach turn at the best of times. The last thing he wanted right now was food. Fukuzawa didn't say anything, just nodded and settling back in his seat. Dazai shifted, uncomfortable under Fukuzawa's searching gaze. He remembers Fukuzawa. He and Mori used to be close, until Fukuzawa just never showed up again. That was a year or so after Dazai's mom had disappeared. Then Dazai went to high school, and suddenly the name from when he was a kid had a face, and 2 adopted children, and a husband. And then Dazai spent time around him, and had already been friends with both of his kids, as he had found out, and then realized how much he probably got let off with because of family connections. He was like a nepo baby, but only for high school. Or maybe it was because Fukuzawa had recognized something that other people hadn't. Something he'd only recognize as someone with a history with Mori. Dazai truly hoped that it was temporary nepotism. It's been a while since you've been in here, Fukuzawa commented. His hands sat clasped together on the desk. Dazai just nodded. His brain felt a little too foggy to think of an answer to that. Fukuzawa smiled again. It seemed too polite for it to be true. The only adults who smiled at him like this were Chuya's parents, Oda, and Oda's boyfriend. Letting Chuya sit in his office the previous year was only his job. No man who had been such close friends with Mori for so long could ever not view him as something less than human. Fukuzawa seemed to be studying his expression. Then he sighed before speaking. How are your siblings doing? I haven't seen either of them for quite a while, Fukuzawa asked. Dazai paused, his eyes narrowed as he searched for the trap in the question. Surely he was looking for something, hoping to catch him out. Elise is fine. She does well in school, Dazai responded, forcing a polite smile onto his face. Fukuzawa nodded, looking pleased to hear that Elise was alright. Ah, yes, she's coming here next year, isn't she? Fukuzawa asked, not expecting a response. Dazai nodded anyway. And how is Oda? Last I knew he was going to pursue a career in literature. Did he get accepted to the university he wanted to go to? Fukuzawa continued. Dazai tensed up involuntarily, hands tightly fisted in the fabric of his school shirt. He got accepted, Dazai said, purposely vague. While Oda had in fact gotten accepted, he had been forced to take a break. He was welcome to go back if he got better, apparently. When? Dazai firmly reminded himself. Fukuzawa hadn't stopped smiling, and it was slightly anxiety-inducing to watch. The man was usually stoic, regarding everything with a muted kind of interest. You're rather close with my children, aren't you, Yosano and Rampo? Dazai blinked and nodded. His brain wasn't working. It didn't want to let him speak aloud. He hated it. Fukuzawa just hummed, glancing out the window at the clear sky. Dazai followed his gaze, looking at the kids sitting under the shade casted from the building, their books out in front of them. Dazai didn't recognize any of them, aside from a long-haired boy that Rampo seemed to have taken a liking to recently. Fukuzawa sighed and spoke. I try my hardest to make this school safe for everyone here. For some people, like your friend Chuya, that means intervening to the best of my ability when bullying occurs. For other people, it means specialized timetables or classes. The library is open for as long as it is for a reason. And there are kids who get all 3 of their meals a day here. Sometimes what needs to be done to ensure a pupil is safe isn't limited to what I can help with. Dazai didn't like where this conversation was going, and he shifted defensively, watching Fukuzawa like a hawk. There are things that can be done about almost everything. That being said, nothing can be done if you don't know something is wrong. Do you understand? Dazai nodded tensely, swallowing the bile rising in his throat. If there are any problems, and I mean any, Fukuzawa said, his expression now serious, you tell me, or you can tell some other teacher, or Miss Alcott, or even one of your friends, and something can be done. Dazai nodded again and spoke, voice quiet. Thank you, Mr. Fukuzawa, but there aren't any problems aside from how that kid spoke to Chuya earlier. Fukuzawa sighed, sounding almost defeated. That kid will be dealt with appropriately. I will not take anything he said lightly. Just then, a knock came on the office door, and a brown-haired lady stepped in, smiling politely. Mr. Fukuzawa, Dazai's father is here. And just like that, the brain fog was back, and Dazai didn't hear the rest of what Fukuzawa had said as he was herded out into the main office to go home. The car ride home has been dangerously silent. The tension in the air when he was handed from Fukuzawa to Mori had been thick enough to cut with a knife. The front door slamming meant Dazai had to suppress a flinch, but he couldn't hide it as he was pushed back against the wall of the living room. Elise, who had stayed off school because she didn't feel well, recoiling with horror as she watched Dazai be pinned against the wall. His back and shoulders hit the wall first, the pain shooting through his body as the wind was knocked out of his chest. His head hit the wall next, despite how he tried to lessen the impact, not wanting Chuya to end up hurt as well. However, an object in motion stays in motion, and his vision blanked for a second when he hit the wall. Mori had a grasp on his shirt collar, lifting him off the ground slightly so that his toes barely touched the floor, and Dazai struggled, his hands grasping and scratching at Mori's wrists. I don't give 2 shits if you're getting into fights, but when I'm at work, you behave or you don't get caught. Mori spat, his voice low. He smelled like antiseptic and the thin hospital bedsheets, and Dazai hated it. I wasn't thinking, Dazai gasped out. Mori's fist in his shirt meant that it was tight around his throat, making it difficult to breathe. Of course you fucking weren't. You never are. You'll have been lucky to have passed your final exams, Mori hissed. Dazai flinched away, just hitting his head again, and he swore he could feel something sticky on the back of his neck. I tried. I did all the work. I'm predicted for the top grades in my year. Dazai protested desperately. Top grades don't mean anything if you can't apply yourself anywhere else. And I don't mean that theater club you were interested in, or wasting time with those friends of yours. I mean open days and online courses. High school will only get you so far. Dazai swallowed and he took a gasping breath as Mori's grip on his shirt tightened. I didn't do the theater, and I'm coming to your stupid medical thing. Dazai stopped speaking when Mori let go of his shirt with one hand, making the motion to hit him. Chuya's my soulmate! He screamed instead, pressing against the wall. Mori froze and narrowed his eyes. Dazai continued, hands shaking where he was still tightly holding onto Mori's other wrist. If you hit me, he'll feel it, and it'll show up on his body. He'll ask questions, Dazai said, ignoring the uncharacteristic tremble in his voice. Mori scowled and let go of his shirt, letting Dazai fall into his hands and knees on the ground, gasping and shaking. He'll never love you. Soulmates aren't defined. Mori snarled. I'm going back to the hospital. Feed Elise. Neither of you are allowed to leave the house, and the bathrooms need to be cleaned. I want them done before I'm back. Mori said, and he left, taking with him the spare key and locking the door. Dazai watched from the floor, breath shuddery and tears in his eyes. Elise was next to him in seconds, hugging him, and he returned the hug, blinking away the tears. It's okay, I'm okay, he whispered repeatedly, unsure who he was trying to convince. It had been a while since Mori had gotten that physical, and on top of Chuya's harsh words earlier, he couldn't cope. You're bleeding, Elise responded, the fear in her voice clear, and Dazai raised a hand, pressing it to the back of his head. He pulled it away to see blood on his fingers, a product of being hit into the wall. He looked up at the mark of blood on the white wall and winced. Then he took a shaky breath and stood up, ignoring the way he was still trembling, and pulling Elise up with him. I'll be fine. You go get the cleaning things and I'll deal with my head. Once we've cleaned, you can have dinner and we'll put on a movie, he said, herding her out of the living room. Are you not gonna eat again? Elise asked quietly. I'm not hungry, Dazai said after a moment. He took a deep breath, then put his hands on either one of Elise's shoulders. Listen to me. What's the golden rule? He asked, voice firm. Elise blinked, fear in her eyes, and Dazai felt sick as he realized he was probably acting like Mori. He didn't let up though. This was important. Don't tell, Elise answered quickly. Dazai nodded and let go of her shoulder, putting on a smile. And what just happened? He asked, voice softer. Nothing happened. Dazai got told off for starting fights, Elise answered, looking at the floor. Dazai sighed, going to run a hand through his hair and then stopping himself as he remembered the blood. Good. Now go get the cleaning things and we'll be done quickly. Taking his shoes off when he came back from work, Fukuzawa ignored his children barreling past him and throwing themselves on the couch in favor of joining his husband in the kitchen. Yosano, Rampo, take your shoes off before you come in or you'll be cleaning the dirt out of the carpet, Fukichi chastised from the doorway, being mostly ignored aside from a dismissive wave. Fukichi sighed in irritation, returning to the vegetables he was chopping. I don't even know why I try with those two. It goes in one ear and out the other, he said, but his voice was laced with fondness. Fukuzawa smiled, pressing a quick kiss against his husband's cheek. They've both had a long day. You can tell them off for it if they do it again tomorrow. Fukichi shook his head, but relented easily. He was never usually the one to enforce the rules, but he was getting tired of the dirty footprints on the carpet. How was work today? Fukuzawa frowned, washing his hands absent-mindedly before going to help prepare the vegetables, slicing a potato in half. There was a fight. It's a high school, so fights are common. He started, furrowing his eyebrows as he cut the potato into squares. But? Fukichi prompted, glancing at him. It was Mori's kid, Fukuzawa said, cutting into the next potato with a slight bit of aggression. Fukichi wrinkled his nose childishly. Fighting with that friend of his again, the Nakahara boy? I swear, from what I can tell, they're always at each other's throats. I have no clue how they're still friends. Fukuzawa laughed a little, shaking his head. They don't fight as often as it might seem. It's usually jokes or pranks that go far enough for a teacher to call them out on it. Though it seems to be that when they do fight, it's devastating for both of them. He sighed again, glaring at the pile of cut potatoes like they were the cause of all of his problems. One of the boys of the year below called Chuya a few bad names. Fukuzawa said pointedly. Fukuchi took a deep breath, pausing what he was doing to properly turn to Fukuzawa. Like it was last year? Fukuchi asked, sounding annoyed. Fukuzawa nodded, the disgust clear on his face. He remembered the mess there had been the previous year surrounding Chuya, between his friend group splitting up and causing trouble, and then the bullying that came just after when the boy had come out. It had been a mess, and the kid and his friend had been in his office for another fight every other day. There had come a point where he had just let Chuya and his friend sit in his office during lunch for a week or so until it had died down. So he knew the kid, and he knew his friends, and he knew how much trouble the two could cause. Honestly, when he realized that they always seemed to be getting into fights together, he considered splitting them up and putting them in separate classes, until he looked at their records. Every class Chuya and Dazai had together that year, Chuya's academic success had rapidly gotten better, and Dazai's attendance, ignoring the classes that Chuya hadn't been in because attendance for those was below 50, magically settled around 80. And then, during the week with lunches spent in his office the previous year, Dazai had been there every day, and he learned that Dazai, rather condescendingly, went over the things Chuya didn't understand in his classes, and Chuya, rather violently, threatened that if Dazai wasn't in school, he would wring his mackerel ass out like a wet towel, and that apparently worked for the two. So, instead of separating them, when he learned they had picked all the same classes, he took special care to ensure they ended up together. It had been a pain in the ass, but it had paid off. Dazai is coming into school more regularly than he had ever before, and Chuya is predicted for nothing lower than a B in his exams. So, really, he was unsurprised when he found out it was Dazai who had broken the boy's nose. He sighed, retaining his thoughts and speaking again. Dazai, Mori's middle son, broke the boy's nose. He has a nasty bruise as well, right across his cheek. As he should have. Genichiro, Fukuzawa reprimanded quickly. Then he conceded the point. While he shouldn't have done it, I would likely have done the same at his age. Fukuchi snickered and was rewarded with a light elbow. I had to call Mori to get him. Mori did not sound happy, and the boy froze when I informed him his father was going to be called. Fukuchi frowned. I understand being upset or annoyed at a parent being called, but freezing up? That's a fear response. No kid should be scared of their parent being called. Fukuzawa nodded in agreement. I know Mori. I believe I still know Mori to a degree. I hate to admit that I find it perfectly plausible for Dazai to be genuinely scared of him. He was pleasant enough when he came to collect Dazai. I just don't trust it. Fukuchi seemed to be thinking, his arms crossed as he leaned against the counter. Is there enough reason to bring social work into it? Do you think he could open a case? Fukuzawa shook his head, bringing his hands to his face. No, the only thing I have is that he seems uncomfortable when discussing his family. He hasn't said anything or done anything to warrant a case. They'd look at it and go, perfectly respectable family, nothing wrong here, case closed. The only thing that might arouse suspicion would be Dazai's clothes and hygiene, but his clothes would be fixed before anything could come from it, and his hygiene would be explained away as a typical teenage boy with sensory issues that can't stand showering. I know what Mori's like. If something is genuinely wrong, there is a situation where social work would just make things worse. Fukuchi sighed. Dazai is the boy with the bandages in the photos Yosano showed us the other night, right? He asked, and Fukuzawa already knew where that question was leading. The bandages are for a skin condition. He bruises really easily, and most contact with his body hurts, according to his medical files. Is there anything on his medical files that could warrant suspicion? Aside from him being underweight, there isn't anything. I checked, twice, extensively, Fukuzawa said tiredly. Fukuchi paused, and for a moment it was quiet, just the sound of the TV from the living room and their breathing. Do you think Rampo knows anything? Yosano, maybe? Fukuchi asked quietly. Fukuzawa shook his head. I don't want to bring them into this. This isn't fair, and if they did know something and told us, it would be a fast track to losing their friendship with Dazai. Abused kids are defensive kids, and Dazai's been protective and defensive since he was young. Do you think Rampo will tell us if something seriously happens? They both know how smart Rampo is, and they both know Rampo and Dazai are fairly close. If anyone was going to have found a way to worm the truth out of Dazai, it would have been Rampo or Chuya, and Chuya clearly hadn't. No, you remember how Rampo, and Yosano for that matter, were when we adopted them. Neither of them would tell anyone what their parents had done or said until months into living with us. They still won't tell us everything. I think Rampo would understand why Dazai wants to hide it. I don't think he'd break Dazai's trust. Fukichi looked away, his eyes drawn to the pictures stuck to the fridge door, and Fukuzawa followed his gaze to the picture of Rampo and Yosano and their friends, and Dazai was in a few of them, smiling, usually sandwiched between Chuya, Rampo, and Kunikida. Dazai had a camera, according to Yosano, and would take it with him if they hung out in a group or went somewhere special. Then he'd send the pictures and videos he took to everyone, and that was where all the pictures on her wall came from. The one on the fridge was supposedly the most recent one of all their friends together. Usually it would be a positive thing, but now all he could see was a group of kids who had their luck cut out for them. They seemed to have drifted together naturally, but Fukuzawa found himself wondering if there was some underlying air of misfortune that drew the lot to each other. A silent, "I've suffered too," that keeps them together. He hates that children are forced to carry a burden like that. He rubbed at his wrist as he thought. It had felt like an uncomfortable burning was eating at his skin for a few hours now, but he had pushed it aside, more focused on work than the discomfort. Now he looked down at his wrists and finally noticed the faint of purple marks littering the sides of his wrists. After a moment, Fukichi noticed it too and quickly took his hand, looking at them. Fukuzawa would normally see a purple blemish on his skin and wish he could scrub it off, nauseous at the reminder of what could have been, of what he had wanted for so long. Now he felt sick for another reason, at the clear half-moon shapes and fainter scratches coming off of them, like someone had been scratching at the wrist, trying desperately to hold on, or push away, or generally hurt. Fukichi demonstrated this by wrapping one of his hands around Fukuzawa's wrist, his fingers lining up with the most prominent of the marks. "What do you think caused that?" Fukichi asked, discomfort clear in his voice. Fukuzawa was at a loss for words as he thought of the many different ways an injury like this could be inflicted. All methods seemed to lean towards self-defense. "I don't even want to know," was his response. Halfway across the city, Mori glared at the angry red scratches on his wrist, a product of his son's sharp nails. Then he covered them with a pair of gloves, on his way to prepare for his next surgery. Chapter 11. When Chuya woke up that morning with a pounding headache and brand new lines on his hips and thighs, he barely blinked. He was too tired to be worried. His sleep had been fitful at best, disoriented glimpses of a tall brunette boy being the only thing he could remember from his broken dreams. All day he had been thinking about what to say when he saw Dazai again, staring at windows or at his hands as he thought. Traipsing up the stairs to the library, he couldn't help but feel sick. He couldn't remember half of what he had said, but he knew none of it had been nice, and that he regretted it immensely. Part of him hoped Dazai wouldn't forgive him and would tell him to get out. But they had fought like this before. He knew that likely wouldn't happen. They had always fed off the fact that they could be as ruthless and cruel to each other as possible, and they'd still end up back together somehow. They were too codependent for their own good, not that he'd ever admit that aloud. He lifted his head to see Dazai carrying a stack of books, watching as Dazai pushed the door to the library open with his hip and noticing the wince at the contact. He frowned. Dazai always seems to be hurt these days. It made sense, he supposed, but he didn't like it. Chuya waited a few moments before he also entered the library, collecting himself. When he went in, the library was completely empty, so it wasn't hard to spot Dazai in the far corner, putting away the copies of a book that was being used in English class, judging by how many there were. Sighing, Chuya put his hands in his pockets and walked over, standing behind and kneeing Dazai. There was an awkward silence in which Dazai didn't acknowledge him, so Chuya took it upon himself to speak. "You look like shit," he commented, his tone empty. It was true. While Dazai looked neater than usual, clean clothes and hair, he looked pale and tired, and he smelled like antiseptic rather than his usual strawberry. Dazai scoffed, not looking up. "You sound like shit. Came here to take out your anger on me?" Dazai asked, sounding annoyingly enthusiastic. Chuya scowled. "Waiting for the opportunity to break my nose if I do?" he retorted quickly. It went quiet as Dazai stood up again, the books all put away on the shelf, surprisingly neat for the fact it had been Dazai of all people putting them away. Dazai turned back to face Chuya, looking at him with a level expression. "If you decide to start talking shit about yourself, maybe," Dazai said blankly. Chuya looked down at his shoes, feeling a mix of resentment and guilt well in his chest. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, kicking the ground. He had been flitting between admitting he was wrong and cursing Dazai's name rapidly, but he knew he shouldn't have said anything that he had, regardless of whether Dazai should have started that fight. And now he knows if it had been Dazai spoken to in that way, he would have done the exact same thing. "I'm sorry for getting so mad at you yesterday and saying all those things. I didn't mean them, and you didn't do anything I wouldn't have also done in your situation." It was quiet again, and Chuya prepared for Dazai to walk away or tell him to leave, until Dazai responded. What was that? I'm not quite sure I heard you," Dazai said in an innocent tone, but Chuya looked up again to see the shit-eating grin on his face and knew he had been heard loud and clear. Chuya relaxed almost instantly, the tension melting from his shoulders. "I said I'm sorry," Chuya said again, louder, voice exasperated. Dazai shrugged, still grinning. "Ah, thought so. I was just so shocked. Chuya apologizing? I thought the day would never come." Dazai said dramatically, a hand on his forehead as he mimed fainting from the shock. Chuya scowled, taking in the display. "Yeah, you've been building a habit of apologizing too recently. Maybe it's infectious," he said sarcastically, taking his hands out of his pockets to cross his arms. "Maybe I really did infect you with intelligence yesterday," Dazai mused aloud, side-eyeing Chuya. Chuya huffed, rolling his eyes. "Yeah, whatever. Do you accept my apology or not?" he asked, subconsciously picking at the skin around his nails, his tone betraying his anxiety. Dazai hummed thoughtfully and sighed like he was making an extremely hard decision. "I suppose I can spare some forgiveness for my dog. It's not his fault he barked. I should have given him more pets," Dazai said, and to punctuate his sentence he roughly pushed his hand into Chuya's hair, messing up the already tangled mess. Chuya squawked in indignation, batting Dazai's hands away, his cheeks going red as he stumbled. He fell backwards as he was knocked off his balance, and he grabbed Dazai's shirt in an attempt to keep himself upright, but instead just pulled Dazai down with him. He hit the floor with a loud thump, hitting his back off one of the bookcases. Dazai promptly fell on top of him, hands holding onto the bookshelf on either side of Chuya's head to prevent himself from falling further. They both froze, faces heating up, and Chuya's mouth fell open slightly as he looked up at Dazai, who had a knee on either side of his hips and a hand either side of his head. Dazai's face was flushed and his eyes were wide, like his brain had short-circuited, breathing quickly and heavily. The sunlight flooding through the large windows in the library lighted his eyes up to have an almost red tint to them. Something in Chuya's brain clicked into place, a realization he couldn't put into words flooding his sensations, making his stomach twist and his mouth go dry. He must be sick. He's sick. He must have a fever. God, let him be sick. There's no other explanation for how hot he felt or for the sudden urge to shiver. Chuya had his eyes firmly trained on Dazai's, but he's sick. He's sick and delusional because Dazai's eyes drop from his to look at the lower half of his face, and neither of them are moving yet. And then Dazai's arms are around his shoulders, and they're hugging. Chuya relaxed instantly. This was familiar territory. Suddenly, the box of things he didn't want to think about regarding Dazai was overflowing. He pretended it wasn't as he returned the hug. They stayed like that for a little longer, clinging to each other in the empty library. Then Dazai spoke, voice quiet but clear in his ear. "Want me to fix your hair?" Dazai offered, pulling away slightly. Chuya let him go, clearing his throat and averting his gaze. Yeah," he muttered as Dazai shifted, and he moved to sit in front of Dazai. "You know, it wouldn't have needed fixing if you hadn't messed it up, so this is your fault." Chuya continued after a moment, feeling Dazai's fingers begin to cart through his hair. Yeah, Dazai said mockingly, working the knots out of Chuya's hair quickly. "It wouldn't," Chuya protested, smiling faintly. Dazai scoffed. "It was already a mess when you walked in. If anything, I made it better," Dazai said, and Chuya could practically hear the face he was making. Dazai tucked Chuya's hair slightly and spoke. "Head up," Dazai demanded rudely, and Chuya obliged, face heating up as he tilted his face up, used to Dazai's rudeness when doing his hair, as though they had to cancel out the familiarity of doing something like that with insults and bickering, like they couldn't quite allow it to be quiet. Chuya didn't want to take that thought further, instead patting his pockets for a hair tie as he felt Dazai begin to braid his hair. He had this taken away from him for less than a day and ended up distraught. He doesn't want to know how he'd end up if they were separated for longer than that. Chapter 12. Dazai's Thursday had been like any other. He had woken up, gotten ready, gone to school, served his current prison sentence, gone home with Chuya, spent 2 hours trying to explain how to rearrange formulas to Chuya for the 5th time, and then left to go back to Mori's house. He had gotten back, made soup for Elise, and sat and watched My Little Pony with her. She keeps insisting it's not a children's show, and Dazai keeps pretending that he doesn't enjoy watching it with her, and carried her to bed when she fell asleep early. It had been a good day. He had gone the entire day without hurting himself. It was a good day, until it wasn't. Dazai was curled up on his bed, his room lit by a lamp on the table beside his bed, and he was drawing in one of his sketchbooks, an idea that had been rattling around in his head since he and Chuya had spent a good chunk of the time they were supposed to be going over maths talking about cats instead. The proportions were probably a bit off, but Dazai didn't spend a lot of time thinking about or drawing cats, so he figured it was good for a first try. He could always draw them more. Honestly, Dazai thought, tracing over a fluffy ear and smudging the pencil to create an illusion of soft fur. This will probably be the new thing I draw in the margins of my daughters. It was peaceful for a moment, long until the front door opened and then slammed shut, the sound broadcasting Mori's arrival home from work. He tensed and looked up as he heard footsteps coming up the stairs, recognizing Mori's dragging steps and listening to where they were heading. When Mori opened his bedroom door, Dazai jumped defensively, scrambling back on his bed and stuffing the sketchbook he had been drawing in under his blanket. Mori didn't even bat an eye, however, and Dazai stared at him with wide eyes, breathing quickly, his body frozen as he waited for him to speak. After a moment of dead silence, Mori spoke, voice cold and empty. "Your brother's dead." A common metaphor used to refer to trauma and the effect it has on the brain, especially a child's brain, is a mirror. The idea is that a child is born with a perfectly intact mirror that shows the kid's reflection, or their identity. Trauma then causes cracks in the mirror, distorting the child's sense of identity and causing trauma responses. The worse the trauma, or the bigger the reaction, the larger the crack or break. Large traumas, such as abuse or assault, instead of causing cracks, can instead have the same result as dropping the mirror. It shatters. Applying this metaphor to Dazai would paint a picture of an already shattered mirror. Put back together with a glue stick found on the floor of a classroom, the remaining pieces pressed together awkwardly in an attempt to pretend it was never broken. As Mori spoke, in that cold and detached tone, Dazai could hear the mirror shatter all over again. He could feel the shards getting stuck in his skin and entering his bloodstream. He hoped one would pierce his heart. "What?" was all he could get out, not recognizing the sound of his own voice. He felt like he wasn't there, instead watching the scene from far away, looking through someone else's eyes. Mori's expression was blank, and there wasn't any inflection behind his tone as he amended his sentence. Dying, not dead. He will be by the end of the night. Dazai was completely frozen, not even blinking, the pencil he had been holding falling out of his grasp. He could clearly see the drawing he had been working on in his mind. 3 fully drawn cats, one in auburn red, one gray with glasses, and one black with bandages around the tail. The 2 bigger cats had been sketched with their tails intertwined, the smaller black one sitting beside them, with the rough sketch of what should have been a scruffy ginger tabby next to it. He could feel the paper crumpled up against his leg in his careless haste to hide it. He has been on a steady decline for a few days, took a massive drop earlier today, and was hospitalized. Dazai blinked a few times more, dumbfounded. Then suddenly Dazai was moving again, throwing himself out of his bed, furious. "You mean he's been in the hospital for hours already? And you knew he was getting worse?" Dazai shouted accusingly, running a hand through his hair and wincing as he caught a nail on the scab of his scalp. "Calm down, Dazai," Mori said, sounding disinterested. "I was working. How did you expect me to tell you?" "I don't know, by picking up the fucking phone, maybe?" Dazai retaliated, his breathing quick and heavy. "Dazai, calm down. You're acting crazy." "I'm acting crazy? You have absolutely no emotion towards the fact that your oldest son is dying!" Dazai spat. "You're behaving like your mother," Mori said, looking at Dazai with narrowed eyes. Dazai bristled, even more angry. Anger was becoming an increasingly common emotion. Something must have been wrong with him, because he's never felt so much before, or felt so strongly. But all soulmate stuff had broken something in him, and instead of always feeling tired or apathetic, he was feeling angry or sad more frequently. "You have no right to talk about my mother like that, or any right to compare me to her," he hissed, pointing a finger at Mori. He knew he was being antagonistic, that this was a bad idea, but there was a newfound confidence bubbling under his skin. If Mori hurt him, Chuya would find out. He wouldn't need to worry about Oda finding out. If he antagonized Mori enough, maybe he'd snap and kill him so he wouldn't need to do it himself. Even if Mori didn't kill him, he deserved the pain. He wanted it. Mori's expression darkened at Dazai's words and body language, taking a threatening step forward before he was interrupted. Upon hearing the commotion, Elise had woken up, standing in the hallway a safe distance behind Mori, holding a brown teddy bear. "What's happening?" she asked, sounding scared. What's wrong with Oda?" Dazai used the distraction to scramble in his room in search of his shoes, and his head snapped up at the question. "Yeah, Mori, what is wrong with Oda, seeing as you never actually told me?" he asked accusingly, finding his shoes and wasting no time in slipping them on. "Lung cancer, metastasized to his heart. He had a heart attack earlier today, hence why he's in the hospital. He won't make it through the night," Mori said, still sounding bored but with a cruel smirk faint on his face. Dazai froze again, in the process of patting his sheets down for his phone. All that coughing. Fuck, why didn't he realize? Why didn't Oda get better? Mori sighed from the doorway, and Dazai snapped back into action, pointedly silent as he found his phone and shoved it in the pocket of the worn-down jeans he was wearing. Antagonizing Mori into hopefully hurting him could wait. Mori would probably get angrier the longer Dazai was gone anyway. He'd probably regret all this later. "And where do you think you're going?" Mori asked, watching Dazai closely. "Where you should be," Dazai spat as he patted his pockets down to check he had everything, and he marched to his door, moving to push past Mori, who was blocking the doorway. Instead of slipping past like he had intended, he ended up being pushed backwards, stumbling and falling against his bed frame, landing with a wince, gasping and feeling a sick sense of satisfaction as pain laced through his wrist when he tried to catch himself. Mori ran a hand through his hair as though trying to calm himself, then put both his hands behind his back. "You know, Dazai, this room is a mess. It has been for quite a long time," Mori said thoughtfully, eyes flitting around the clothes on the floor and the schoolwork everywhere. "I expect this room to be spotless by tomorrow. You can go to the hospital and say goodbye to Oda once you're done. Dazai's jaw dropped, his eyes welling up with tears as he looked up at Mori from the floor, forgetting about his bid for attention from Mori. That had not been what he was expecting, not in a million years. He tried to protest, the words running through his brain but dying before they could escape his mouth, as though there was an invisible force preventing him from speaking. Mori paid him no attention, instead leaving the room and closing the door, locking it from the outside. A single tear fell, tracking its way down his cheek. He heard Mori speak to Elise outside. "Come on downstairs, Elise. We'll call Ango, that way you have a chance to speak to Oda, okay?" Mori's muffled voice came through the door. "But, Dazai..." Elise protested hesitantly, being cut off. Yes, it's such a shame Dazai didn't want to say goodbye, isn't it? Oh well, shows just how much he cares about his family, I suppose. With that, Dazai could hear Mori guide Elise down the stairs, and the sound of Mori's phone dialing what he knew would be Ango's phone number. He felt like he might throw up, violently. Dazai would like to say that the second he heard the footsteps hit the bottom of the stairs, he was up again, scrounging his desk for his bus card and breaking his door down to leave. But that would be a lie. For a while, he sat there, frozen on the floor, the tears silently falling down his cheeks as he stared in the direction of his bedroom door. His vision was blurry and his thoughts fuzzy, a distant pain in his head and wrist poking at the edges of his awareness, begging for his attention. He couldn't find it in himself to care. He didn't know how long he sat there, aware but not taking in anything that's happening, the faint sound of cars passing or the occasional group of teens sounding foreign to him. It was a buzzing in his pocket that pulled him out of the murky swamp that had become his thoughts, blinking away the mist as he pulled his phone out to see Chuya's typical goodnight message. New messages. Tuesday, 6th of May. Good night. Yesterday, Wednesday, 7th of May, 1928. Have you really lost your phone, dumbass? 2147. Good night, loser. Find your phone! This is getting old. I'll just send you letters instead of messages if you don't find it soon. Today, Thursday, 8th of May, 1512. Meet me back gates. 2151. I know you found your phone again. There's no excuse for you to not answer me. Stupid mackerel, I see you're online. Dazai took a deep breath, bringing himself back down to earth from wherever he had floated off to. He needed to get it together. He could start by replying to Chuya and then work from there. Maybe I'm not responding to you because I have better things to do. Also, if you're gonna call me a mackerel, at least spell it right. It took too much out of Dazai's energy to type out those responses. He did it anyway. Taking the moment to do something other than stare blankly gave him a moment to let the pain still in his wrist and head ground him for a second, to let him come to an important conclusion. He'd be damned before he just gave up and spent the night cleaning his room while his brothers suffered. And so he picked himself off the floor, wiping the tears from his face, and went to his desk, picking through the various papers to find his bus card, and slipping it in his pocket. Then, for the first time in months, he opened the curtains to his window, looking out at the dark street. His phone chimed with Chuya's response, so Dazai turned the screen on again, purposely breathing slowly as he read it and responded. Shut the fuck up, you annoying piece of shit. I just wanted to say goodnight, not get bullied for how I spell. I just don't pay attention, that's all. Sure, whatever you say. Anyway, you're here to say goodnight. Goodnight. Chuya didn't respond immediately, even though the message was seen instantly, so Dazai turned his attention to the window, inspecting the latch, unsure if he'd be able to open it quietly. However, he put his phone down and carefully pressed open each latch, each one making nothing more than a soft click as they came undone. He let out a sigh of relief as they barely made any sound, hurriedly ensuring they were all clear. When they were all unlocked and pulled away, he hooked his fingers under the wood of the frame, pulling it up, struggling slightly as the window hadn't been opened since the previous summer. When it was finally pushed up enough that he could get his hands under it, he pushed it up the rest of the way, his wrist screaming at him for every moment it was under pressure. It didn't take long until it was as high as he could get it, and he paused, breathing heavily and shaking his wrist out, glancing down at his phone when Chuya finally responded. Are you okay? You don't normally message like that. Or just let me go to sleep. You'd normally want to talk first. Dazai looked down at the message, catching his lip between his teeth, watching the typing bubble appear as Chuya sent another message. My wrist really hurts if you're looking for something to talk about. I don't know. You're seeing my messages. Are you okay? Dazai took a deep breath and then responded again. I'm fine. I'm just particularly tired tonight. Trying to explain how algebra works to you wasn't easy, you know? You're like a cat, clingy yet would never admit it. Why are you so attached to me, huh? Paying attention to how I type? Something to tell me, Chuya? The effect was instant, Chuya responding quickly. Fuck you, I'm not clingy, you asshole, I hate you! Good night! Despite the situation, Dazai smiled. Good night, darling. Sleep well. Fuck you! Clearing his throat and ignoring the burning on his face, Dazai returned his phone to his pocket, focusing on the major issue at hand. His older brother was dying, and he was locked in his bedroom and planning on scaling the side of his house to leave. Smiling and blushing over his text messages with Chuya seemed like a stupid waste of time now. However, he was calmer. A little. At least he had moved from his floor. Swinging his leg over his windowsill, he looked down at the ground, which seemed dizzyingly far away. He knew he wasn't that high up, only on the second floor, but he also knew that falling would hurt. More importantly, because he couldn't care less about getting hurt himself, falling would hurt Chuya. Unfortunately, he didn't have time to think of any alternative solutions. So he took a deep breath and he swung the other leg over the edge as well, gripping onto the ledge firmly with his hands, twisting his body and sliding off the ledge, dangling precariously with his face up against the wall. The movement wasn't as smooth as he would have liked, the force of the sudden drop pulling at his joints, making him gasp in pain as his wrist flared up again, the pain feeling like flames licking up the side of his arm. He could feel himself shaking and his palms sweating. All he could think was, don't look down. After a moment, he firmly closed his eyes, moving agonizingly slowly as he shifted his way along the length of his window until he could kick out and reach the roof of the garage. After a few tries, he managed to get his foot on it, and quickly scrambled the rest of the way onto it, falling on his knees the second he was safe, his hands trembling violently, the pain in his wrist dialing down significantly due to the lack of pressure. It wasn't hard from there, he knew. He jumped down from the garage roof easily, wincing as he rolled his ankle but landing nonetheless, the damp grass soaking through the fabric of his shoes. He didn't give himself a chance to think when he landed, instantly beginning to run, not giving Mori another second to potentially realize he was leaving than he already had. Dazai only stopped running when he was 3 streets away and he could see the bus stop across the street. By some major miracle, the bus was already pulling into the stop by the time he arrived, his bus card already in his hand. He got a few weird looks, but he could understand why. He looked a mess, wearing dirty jeans, a t-shirt that didn't belong to him, and panting like he'd just run a marathon, not even mentioning the bandages. But he was let onto the bus anyway, collapsing in a seat near the back. It would be at least an hour to the hospital, and he didn't bring his headphones. Instead, he let the brain fog take over. He couldn't be here anymore. When Dazai got to the hospital, the first thing he could think about was how much it smelled like Mori. The second was how much he hated doctors. Thankfully, when he showed up at the reception looking like he'd seen a ghost, the lady behind the desk had been polite enough to give a pen and a sticky note to write out what he was looking for since he couldn't get the words out. She had been patient, letting him take his time to write what he needed and explain the situation. She had left to talk to another doctor, visiting hours long since ended, but when the other doctor saw him, he had smiled and waved, and he overheard parts of their conversation when the doctor mentioned something about Mori and his prodigy son. He was granted an exception, the nurse behind the desk claiming it was due to the circumstances and leading him down the hall. At the entrance to the ward, she stopped and turned to Dazai, speaking carefully. He's just along this hall, but I must warn you, he's not got long left. We've got him on as much medication as we can to make it comfortable, and he's exhausted. With any luck, he'll pass as though he was falling asleep. But there is a chance he passes while you're visiting. She said, her voice soft, as though she was talking to a child. Dazai swallowed and nodded numbly, biting on his lip, ripping the soft skin and tasting blood on the tip of his tongue. The nurse then smiled sorrowfully and pointed out a room in the middle of the hall, patting his shoulder in a reassuring manner before leaving to return to the desk. When Dazai was left alone in the almost empty corridor, the walls all white aside from the blue one on his right, he couldn't help but feel impossibly small and powerless. He could fix most things, or at least he could try to. He had always been able to tell what was wrong and offer solutions. He was built to be a problem solver, to be of use in all kinds of situations. Yet he hadn't worked it out. He was told he's sick and he didn't dig further. He hadn't even tried. Now he was being confronted with another problem he couldn't solve. Like a computer system, he was failing, an execution error buried deep in the code, unfixable, the kind where it was easier to start over. Each step he took towards the room felt heavier than the last, the dread welling in his chest as though the movement was making him motion sick. Finally, he pushed open the door, peeking through the gap into the dimly lit hospital room hesitantly. Ango was sitting next to the bed, his hands clutched together and his head lowered as though he was in prayer. Ango's suit jacket had been discarded to the side, and his sleeves rolled up. Dazai could see the reddish-purple marks on Ango's hands and inner arms, where Oda must have had blood taken from. Oda seemed to be asleep, eyes closed peacefully, his hand holding onto Ango's arm. When he heard the door creak, Ango's head shot up in surprise, and his eyes widened when he saw Dazai. Dazai? What are you doing here? You're the... Mori said you didn't want to see him. Ango asked quietly, tone confused. He sounded exhausted, like he hadn't slept for days. On closer inspection, he looked like it too, dark circles under his eyes and pale cheeks. Dazai just swallowed, slipping inside the uncomfortably spacious room and looking around awkwardly. I didn't know Oda was here until a little while ago. I came here straight away, he said quietly, his voice sounding scratchy and foreign. Ango frowned, looking like he might ask another question when Oda stirred, and both of them had their full attention on him instead. Dazai? Oda asked tiredly, blinking repeatedly as he made to sit up, being hastily stopped by Ango. Dazai's breath caught at the sound of his name and he nodded, stepping closer. Oda looked horrifically pale, and thinner than Dazai had ever seen him. It was almost like somebody had drained the color out of him. To say he looked sick was an understatement. He looked dead already. What are you doing here? Oda asked, and Dazai glanced at Ango. I wanted to see you. Dazai responded quietly, and Ango got up, bringing over a chair for Dazai to sit on, so Dazai was on one side of the bed and Ango was on the other. Dazai sat awkwardly, his back and neck crawling, feeling distinctly uncomfortable with the open space behind him and his inability to see the door. Oda chuckled slightly, the laugh turning into a weak cough, his heart rate spiking on the monitor. I am in no shape to be accepting visitors. Oda got out after his coughs died down, shaking his head. You shouldn't be here. Dazai scowled. But I am. I wanted to be, he responded defensively. Oda just smiled and took his hand, squeezing it. His hands were cold, colder than Dazai's, which Dazai would have probably made a joke about if it was another scenario. Why didn't you tell me you weren't going to get better? Dazai asked, his voice going quiet again. Ango looked away guiltily, and Oda sighed. I shouldn't have hid it, is what Oda settled on saying after a moment. But honestly, how do you think I would have told you? Deep down, I think you already knew, Dazai. You just didn't want to believe it. Dazai wanted to break down sobbing because he knew Oda was right. It wouldn't have changed anything if he had known, and in the back of his mind, he already had known. It had been evident in the avoidance in thinking about it, or in his lack of investigation into the topic. It had been evident in the way he had been constantly reminding himself, changing his thoughts from if Oda gets better to when Oda gets better. There had never been a when. Dazai looked down at his hand in Oda's and took a deep breath, steadying himself. He didn't want to have Oda spend their last moments together trying to get him to stop crying. Can we just pretend that nothing's going to happen? Just for a little while? Dazai found himself asking, feeling rather childish. Thankfully, Oda just smiled and nodded, and Ango looked relieved at the idea. How's school been? Oda ended up asking, and Dazai relaxed a little in his chair. School's been fine. I got in a fight. I have an in-school suspension for the rest of the week and library duty. Dazai explained, shrugging his shoulders. I won though, so it's fine. Oda laughed and Ango groaned, both unsurprised. Well, at least you won. How's Juya been? Does he know your soulmates yet? Oda asked next, tilting his head. Dazai raised an eyebrow and glanced at Ango questioningly, who seemed unsurprised by the question. Whether that was because Oda had told him or because it was obvious they would be soulmates, Dazai didn't know. Dazai thought about answering for a second, hesitating and glancing at Ango again. He wanted to be able to tell Oda the truth, that he had fought with Chuya again, that Chuya had been almost adamant Dazai wasn't his soulmate, that Chuya didn't like him, but at the same time, he didn't want Oda to be disappointed. Maybe, when he thinks back on this moment in the future, he might realize that it was his selfishness that made him not want to tell Oda the truth. That maybe, deep down, there was still a glimmer of hope that Chuya might change his mind. Or maybe he just wanted to play pretend for a while. Ango looked away and then back, nodding, as though knowing what Dazai was thinking, as though encouraging him to lie. Chuya's been fine. I saw him earlier today. I went to his house. Dazai paused and bit his lip, thinking. Chuya knows we're soulmates. He lied. Oda bought into it, which made Dazai's heart ache. He had barely tried to hide the fact he was lying. It should have been obvious, but Oda was smiling and squeezing his hand again, so Dazai decided to be grateful for it. That's good, isn't it? How did he react? Oda asked, sounding genuinely happy for him. Dazai knew Ango knew he was lying. He could tell from the wince and the look of hurt and guilt that was on his face. It hurt knowing Ango knew. It hurt knowing Oda didn't. It hurt knowing he was still going to lie anyway. He hates lying. He does it anyway. So, Dazai plastered a big smile on his face and kept going. Honestly, he didn't take it well at first. He was very surprised and didn't believe me. Then, in natural us fashion, he punched me a little too hard and suddenly we had matching bruises, like you said would happen. Oda nodded along, looking proud. But after he got over the shock, we sat down and talked it out and, well, Dazai tactfully looked away, still smiling. He's always been a good actor. Does that mean you're dating him now? Oda asked, and Dazai shrugged, not confirming or denying it. He wouldn't lie about that. At least, not outright. Oda laughed, the sound strained and difficult, and he spoke again. It was about time you two got over yourselves. I'm happy for you, Dazai. Oda said earnestly, and Dazai just nodded, his throat closing up. Oda smiled, reaching up to ruffle his hair, and Dazai didn't complain, leaning down slightly to make it easier and just letting it happen. I need you to promise me something. Oda stage whispered with a wide smile, beckoning Dazai closer. Dazai leaned in closer, devastated when instead of the clean and slightly smoky smell he associated with Oda, was instead replaced with the smell of everything else in this god-forsaken place. Antiseptic and medicine. He shook the thought away, listening to Oda speak instead. I'm going to need you to keep an eye on Ango for me. Make sure he doesn't do something stupid like buy a motorbike or drop out of school once I'm gone. Dazai smiled despite himself, snickering slightly at Ango's offended sniff. I'm not gonna drop out of school or buy a motorbike, don't you worry, Ango said haughtily, but Dazai could see the tears in his eyes. You should be more worried about Dazai or his boyfriend doing that. Oda laughed again, shaking his head. It might do Chuya or Dazai some good. You have things you want to do. They have plenty more time. Oda said, looking at Ango pointedly, and Dazai felt sick at how they looked at each other. They both knew this was the last time they'd see each other. Oda's words had sounded pretty final. Oh, and Dazai? Oda said as though I was forgetting something. Dazai sat bolt upright, listening attentively as Oda turned to look at him again. I know Mori wants you to pursue medicine. Don't. Not unless you want to. Dazai felt dumbstruck by the words, not expecting that. Oda had never shown much interest in his future career aside from a simple, you'd be good at that, if he mentioned something. Why would Oda bring this up now? If you want to be a doctor, or a surgeon, or whatever, you'd be amazing at it. But if you want to be a scientist, or a detective, or an artist, or a pirate for God's sake, then just do it. You could be anything you want to. If you are going to do anything to try to honor me after I've gone, do what you want. Not what anyone else wants. What you want. Dazai just stared at Oda with wide eyes, his mouth not cooperating with him, not allowing him to say what he wanted to say. He wanted to agree, and he wanted to protest. He wanted to cry and tell Oda that he'd do whatever Oda wanted as long as he was there to see it. He didn't want to have to do anything to honor Oda once he died. He wanted Oda to be alive. He didn't want him to die. It wasn't fair. None of this was. He wanted his big brother. But he couldn't have his brother. Not forever. So he nodded numbly. Okay, I understand, he whispered. The words had felt like sandpaper in his throat. After a glance at Ango and the look of distraught on his face, he let go of Oda's hand, stepping out into the empty hallway for a moment to let Oda speak to Ango alone. He wasn't sure what happened to people whose soulmates die. Do they just keep living? How could anyone just keep living after having their person taken away from them? How do they want to keep living? Do they just fall in love with someone else? Maybe a part of their soul dies as well, so they have matching wounds, like the entire point of the marks in the first place. His first thought that there was something poetic about it. Then he reconsidered it. People are what make it poetic. Nothing about the idea itself is poetic. It's just sad. He tore himself out of his thoughts to return to the room. Peeking through the door, he saw Ango gently kiss Oda's forehead, their hands intertwined. He looked like he was falling asleep again. Dazai cautiously stepped into the room again, hesitant to disturb the peace. Ango didn't look up from where he was studying Oda's face. Dazai looked away as the warning from the nurse earlier had flashed in his head. He didn't want to watch as Oda's breathing slowed down. Dazai instead looked out the window at the lights from the city, the defiant shadows of buildings fading until they were black smudges on the horizon. There was an irregularity in the beeping of the heart monitor, which Dazai's practiced ear picked out a few seconds before Ango did, and within another few seconds it had started beeping more rapidly. It only took a few seconds for there to be multiple nurses and a doctor from earlier in the room, and while Dazai would normally be able to pick out what they were doing, all he was looking at was the empty space beside the bed where the nurses were avoiding by force of habit, where there was a noticeable lack of a crash cart. It only took a few more seconds for the repetitive beeping from the heart monitor to be replaced with a single steady tone, and Dazai barely had time to register what was happening before he was being ushered out of the room by a nurse. Ango was out in the hallway seconds later, looking sick and on the verge of a breakdown. Dazai just stared out at the now closed door where he had been standing a few seconds ago, his older brother still alive and just sleeping. The tears that had been welling up and threatening to fall all evening had suddenly vanished, taking with them all capacity of feeling anything other than tired and sick. His head was pounding furiously, his vision swimming. They say the brain remains active until 7 minutes after the heart stops beating. As far as Dazai is aware, that's not entirely accurate. While, yes, as a general rule, people die after 7 minutes without oxygen to the brain, it can vary between person, and people can still be resuscitated until they're completely dead. As long as there is an adequate amount of brain function left, a manual restart of the heart and CPR will return oxygenated blood flow long enough for the body to start, hopefully, working on its own again. Otherwise, should it be required for some reason, an oxygen machine and a pacemaker should be effective. However, the level of activity, that's more limited. Permanent brain damage can come within a few minutes of a lack of oxygen, and neuron death can happen in as little as 5. It depends from person to person, with different factors such as activity level, weight, and cardiovascular health affecting the timescales. At any point after 5 minutes, brain damage can result in brain death, a term used to refer to when a person's brain functions so little that they can't do anything. They're comatose, with barely any function aside from breathing. Dazai is unsure of the exact truth behind the statement. He frequently fills gaps in his knowledge with the answers he deems would make the most sense through patterns he recognizes in information, but the last thing he wanted to do was look it up. However, he was able to watch as approximately 6 minutes after Oda's heart had stopped beating, the marks on Ango's hands and arms began to fade away. He doesn't think he'd ever seen someone cry so much. Funnily enough, having poor cardiovascular health is actually a benefit in the eventuality that a person's heart stops beating, as the brain will likely survive for longer, more used to a lack of oxygen due to a buildup in the veins preventing fast blood flow. His brain unhelpfully supplied him with the knowledge that Oda likely hadn't stopped smoking after his cancer diagnosis, comparing the various bundles of his knowledge within the current situation. The extra few months of smoking had probably prolonged his life by a minute. He was stuck viewing the scene as though he was detached from it, taking in the events the way he always did, like information, clues for another puzzle to solve, for another problem that needs to be fixed, another learning experience. After a while of waiting in the hallway, sitting on the uncomfortable metal chairs as Dazai desperately willed the brain fog to come back, for a different way to detach himself, a nurse came out to inform them they could go in and say their final goodbyes. Dazai stayed firmly planted on the chair as Ango went in. He wanted his last image of Oda in his mind to be the one of him peacefully falling asleep. He didn't want to see him now, knowing he'll never see him alive again. Knowing that the entire time Oda was dying, he was just thinking about how it was happening, that he didn't feel anything, that he couldn't. Waiting for Ango, he briefly recognized a few nurses passing by and offering short condolences, one or two keeping half an eye on him as they went about their duties. Dazai just stared at the floor, forcing his eyes to unfocus, allowing the brain fog back in, barely thinking as he just stared absently. He didn't remember how much time passed, his brain fuzzier than it had ever been, but eventually Ango came back out, talking seriously with another person. Dazai didn't look up. He vaguely registered being guided up and out of the hospital, and being handed a blanket when he curled up on the front passenger seat of Ango's car. The blanket smelled like Oda did. Ango gave him a lift home, mentioning something about not wanting Dazai to get the bus alone right now, and they ended up stopping to buy hot chocolate on the way back to Mori's house. The car ride was mostly silent, neither of them in the mood to talk. The only sound was Ango's occasional sharp inhale as he was trying not to cry anymore. Dazai thought he would have felt grateful if he could feel anything other than empty. He didn't bother sneaking back inside the house when he was dropped off, leaving the blanket behind in the car, despite Ango's offer for him to keep a hold of it. He wouldn't get to keep it for long if he brought it in with him. Dazai walked in through the front door without care for how loud or quiet he was, hating it was his habits forcing him to be near silent, and unsurprised to see Mori sitting and waiting for him in the living room. "I distinctly remember locking your door," Mori said with muted interest as Dazai stopped just inside the room. Dazai nodded, staring at Mori tiredly, not blinking. "You did," he muttered. Mori tilted his head, smiling. It looked genuine, so genuine that Dazai didn't even consider it was real. Did you get to say goodbye? Mori asked, standing up and walking over. Dazai nodded again, unable to say anything. Mori sighed, shaking his head as he stopped just in front of Dazai. Such a pity. Oda had great potential too, if he had just channeled his passion for writing elsewhere. Not that it matters now. Still. Dazai felt sick listening to Mori talk about Oda like he had just been some experiment, a toy to play with, but he couldn't do anything about it. Nobody could. Now, Dazai, we need to think of a consequence for you leaving so late and directly disobeying me. Mori said importantly, beginning to walk again, patting Dazai's shoulder as he walked behind him. Dazai stayed extremely still, suppressing the flinch at the touch and resisting the urge to run the second Mori was out of his line of sight. Mori thought for a moment, humming consideringly, the silence suffocating Dazai. Then, with a wicked smirk screaming that this had been planned from the beginning, Mori spoke again, finishing his circle around Dazai and returning to the space in front of him. I suppose, though, disobeying me like this is quite a bold thing to do. Such initiative, it should be rewarded, correct? Dazai shivered, uncomfortable and sick, the pit of emptiness in his stomach being replaced by dread. Mori looked him up and down thoughtfully. Is there anywhere on your body you can think that won't bruise? Mori asked, and Dazai didn't answer, assuming the question was a rhetorical one. Mori sighed in disappointment at the lack of response, instead reaching into his pocket. He was still wearing the suit he had been when Dazai left. Well then, a reward for being brave enough to go against what I told you to do, Mori said after a moment, stepping forward and taking Dazai's hand. Dazai opened his palm on instinct, and seconds later, a shiny metal scalpel wrapped in a white handkerchief was placed in his hand. Dazai stared down at it, his sense of shock being dulled by some hidden force, but he felt his eyes widen and his mouth go dry regardless. Pretty, isn't it? Mori asked, smirking and tilting his head. Sharp, too. Mori walked behind him again, putting his hands firmly on his shoulders and leaning in to whisper in his ear. Wouldn't you like the chance to join your dearest older brother? Mori continued, voice taunting. Then Mori removed his hands from Dazai's shoulders. Dazai was still staring at the scalpel, his grip on it tightening slightly. Like earlier, he didn't feel like he was in his body, that instead he was watching through another person's eyes. Mori walked away, voice carrying through the house, the disinterest clear. Try not to make a mess. Dazai turned the scalpel over in his hands, the sharp edge reflected in the light. He wanted his older brother.